Letter from Joseph Bodenland to his wife, Mina. August the 20th, in the year 2020. My dearest Mina, I entrust this to the postal services, although they've been disorganized by the recent impact raids. What hasn't? The headline on today's still is, "Space-time ruptured, scientists say." Let's hope the crisis will lead to an immediate conclusion of the war, or who knows where we shall all be in 6 months' time. But to more cheerful things. Routine has now been re-established in the house, although we all still miss you sorely. In the silence of the empty rooms at evening, I hear your footfall. But the grandchildren keep the least corner occupied during the day. Nurse Gregory is very good with them. Neither Tony nor Poll have mentioned their parents since poor Molly and Dick were killed. Perhaps their sense of loss is too deep, though there's no sign of that in their play. Who knows? This morning, I suppose, there was some morbidity, but the game was inspired by a slightly older girl, Doreen, who came round here to play. You don't know Doreen. Her family are refugees who've arrived in Houston since you left for Indonesia. Doreen came round on her scouter, which she's just about old enough to drive, and the three of them went to the swimming pool area. It was a glorious morning, and they were all in their swimsuits. I watched for a while and then struggled on with my memoirs, but I was too anxious to concentrate. When I looked in on the children again, they'd moved to the sand area and were burying Doreen's scouter. They had their spades out and were making a mound over the machine. They came back to the grave time and time again. Sometimes they brought twigs and small branches snapped off from the sheltering acacias. More often flower heads. They called to each other as they ran. Nurse Gregory had the morning off, so they were playing entirely alone. Doreen was talking about a feast. What they were doing, she insisted, was a feast. I gave up work and sat watching them. I tell you, theirs seemed the only meaningful activity in the crazy warring world, and it was inscrutable to me. Eventually they had the grave covered with flowers. Doreen got down on her knees and began to pray. She made our two solemn grandchildren do likewise. "God bless you, Jesus, on this bright day," she said. "Make this a good feast in thy name." Then they did a sort of dance about the pretty grave. As far as I know, Molly and Dick never taught their children a word of prayer. Perhaps the traditional comforts of religion were exactly what these orphans needed. What if those comforts are illusions? Even the scientists are saying that the fabric of space-time has been ruptured, and reality, whatever that may be, is breaking down. The feast ceremony was basically pagan, the Christian formulae mere frills. For the dance the children did among their plucked flowers was, I'm sure, an instinctual celebration of their own physical health. Round and round the grave they went. They live in myth. Under the onslaught of school, intellect will break in, crude robber intellect, and myth will wither and die like the bright flowers on their grave. And yet, that isn't true. Isn't the great overshadowing belief of our time that ever-increasing production and industrialization bring the greatest happiness for the greatest number all round the globe? Isn't that a myth to which most people subscribe? But that's a myth of intellect, not of being, if such distinction is possible. I'm philosophizing again. One of the reasons they chucked me out of the government. Write soon. Ever your loving husband, Joe. The Times First Leader, August 20th, in the year 2020. Deadly relationships. Western scientists are now in general, although not entire accord, for even in the domain of science opinion is rarely unanimous, that mankind is confronted with the gravest crisis of its existence, a crisis not to survive which is not to survive at all. Crises which in prospect appear uniquely ominous have a habit of assuming family resemblances in retrospect. We observe that they were critical but not conclusive. To say this is not to be facetious. Professor James Ransom's comment in San Francisco yesterday brought a sense of proportion to the increasingly alarmist news of the instability of the infrastructure of space, let alone that nuclear activity might have rendered it unstable. The professor's remark that the present instability represents, in his words, the great grey ultimate in pollution, should remind us that the world has survived serious pollution scares for over 50 years. However, there are sound reasons for regarding our present crisis as nothing less than unique. All three opposed sides in the war, Western, South American, and Third World powers, have been using nuclear weapons of increasing caliber within the orbits of the Earth-Moon system. Nobody has gained anything, unless one includes the doubtful benefit of having destroyed the civilian moon colonies. But the general feeling has been one of relief that these weapons were used above rather than below the stratosphere. Such relief, we now see, was premature. We are learning yet another bitter lesson on the indivisibility of nature. We have long understood that sea and land formed an interrelated unit. Now, far too late according to Professor Ransom and his associates, we perceive a hitherto undiscerned relationship between our planet and the infrastructure of space which surrounds and supports it. The infrastructure has been destroyed, or at least damaged, to the point at which it malfunctions unpredictably, and we are now faced with the consequences. Both time and space have gone on the blink, as the saying has it. We can no longer rely even on the sane sequence of temporal progression. Tomorrow may prove to be last week, or last century, or the age of the pharaohs. The intellect has made our planet unsafe for intellect. We are suffering from the curse that was Baron Frankenstein's in Mary Shelley's novel. By seeking to control too much, we have lost control of ourselves. Letter from Joseph Bodenland to his wife, Mina. August the 22nd, in the year 2020. New Houston. My dearest Mina, where were you yesterday, I wonder? The ranch, with all its freight of human beings, spent yesterday and much of the day before in a benighted bit of what I presume was medieval Europe. It was our first taste of a major time-slip. How easily one takes up the protective jargon. A time-slip sounds no worse than a landslide, but you know what I mean, a fault in the spatial infrastructure. Now we're all back here in the present. That term, the present, must be viewed with increasing suspicion as time-slips increase. But you'll understand that I mean the date and hour shown unflinchingly on the calendar chronometer here in my study. Are we lucky to get back? Could we have remained adrift in time? One of the most terrifying features of this terrifying thing is that so little is understood about it. Come home at once, Mina. Then at least we shall be among the Incas, or fleeing Napoleon, together. Reality is going to pot. One thing's for sure, we never had as secure a grasp on reality as we imagine. But let me stick to facts. The ranch got into a time-slip. Suddenly we were back wherever it was. The sky went from its usual washed blue to a dirty grey. There was no shock or jar, nothing like an earth tremor, but the sensation was so abrupt that I ran to the windows. Cloud was rolling in overhead. Over the plain, coming in fast, was thick mist. In a few minutes it surged over the wall like a sea and burst all over the garden and patio. And not only that, ahead I could see the land stretching as usual and the low roofs of the old stables, but beyond the roofs the hills had gone. And to the left, driveway and pampas grass had disappeared. They were replaced by a lumpy piece of country, very green and broken, dotted with green trees, like nowhere hereabouts. Paul and Tony were already running outside. I caught up with them and held their hands. We stood there staring into the mist. Nurse Gregory came out to join us, taking everything with her usual unflustered calm. When a few minutes had passed, and we were recovering from our first shock, I stepped forward towards where the drive had been. There was a clean line where our sand ended. Beyond it was rank grass, growing as high as the children's knees, and beaded silver with rain. Great shaggy oaks stood everywhere. A path was worn among them. "I can see a hut over there, Grampy," Tony said, pointing. There was a hut. It was a poor affair, built of wood, with wooden slates on the roof. Behind it was an outhouse, also wooden, and a picket fence with bushes by it. With an increase in unease, I saw that two people, I thought a man and a woman, stood behind the fence, staring in our direction. I pointed them out to the children. "They won't hurt us, will they?" said Tony, staring across at the two strangers. The three of us walked together under the trees, leaving Nurse Gregory to stand on the house side of the danger line. "Don't go too far," she called. Supposing the house snapped back to 2020, leaving us stuck in whatever benighted neck of the woods we'd come across. Or supposing, something dreadful came and attacked us, something we didn't know about. The kids wanted to go and see the woman by the wooden house. I made them walk the other way. There was a dog lying inside the picket fence. Tony called bravely. The dog barked. Our shoes became wet from the long grass. You'll think this tale ends in an awful anticlimax, my dear. Be glad it is so. We remained in that time slip for 35 hours or thereabouts, but saw no one else. I summoned our 3 serviles and reprogrammed them to keep watch. Fortunately, I had a defense program to hand. I should add that our phones to the outside world were non-functioning, but of course the nuclear core supplied us with all the power we needed. During the night, we heard dogs barking in the hills. Maybe there were jackals as well. That was all. This morning, we flipped back into the present, as easily and quietly as we'd left it. I rode round in the folder this morning, surveying the damage. Where the driveway was, we have a line of massive oaks and beeches. Where did we go? Europe? The Balkans? What time was it? What century? Was it some alternate Earth? When does the next time slip strike? You must come back, my dear Mina. The war must inevitably fall apart if this schism in the fabric of space-time continues. Come back. The children need their grandmother. At such a time, I must invoke God and say, God knows I need you. Your ever-loving husband, Joe. CompC cable from Nurse Gregory to Mrs. Mina Bodenland, August 25th in the year 2020, New Houston. Greatly regret announced disappearance Mr. Joseph Bodenland during brief time slip dawn this morning. Duration 25 minutes. Stop. Police are searching area with negative results. Stop. Children distressed and asking for you. Stop. Please instruct urgent and return New Houston urgent. Stop. Nurse Sheila Gregory. Extract from West Central telecable record of conversation over open phone between Nurse Sheila Gregory and Mrs. Mina Bodenland. The time slip took place at 0640 this morning. It woke me and Mr. Bodenland up, but the children stayed asleep. I met him in the hall and he said, "There's a lake with mountains right outside." I'd already seen it from my bedroom. Snow on the mountains and a road by the lake with a coach being pulled along by 2 horses. And my husband went out alone. He insisted I stay indoors, Mrs. Bodenland. I saw him drive the Felder out of the garage. He drove into that new landscape. There was no road, just pasture, and he went very slowly. Then I couldn't see him any more for a clump of trees. My guess is that he figured this time slip would have the same duration as the last one, a day and a half. Maybe he thought he'd just drive to the lake and find out where it was. I went off to fix myself a coffee, and just as I was coming back, I was entering the living room, and wham! The time slip ceased just like that, and everything went back to normal. I ran out and called, but it was no good. Tony and Polly were real upset when they woke up. They've been crying for you and their mummy all day, on and off. Tell them I'm on my way home, and please keep them indoors. You've probably heard, organization is breaking down. The world's going plain crazy. Keep the robots programmed for defense. The Taped Journal of Joseph Bodenland. A record must be kept for the sanity of all concerned. Luckily, old habits die hard, and I had my tape memories stowed in the car, together with a stack of other junk. I'd managed to drive over the terrible roads to a village. When I saw buildings coming up, I drove the Felder off the track behind an outcrop of rock, where I hoped it was both safe and unobtrusive for the night. I figured I'd cause less stir if I went in on foot than in a 4-wheel horseless vehicle. They didn't possess such things here, that was certain. The scenery was alpine, with broad green valleys surmounted by mountain peaks. The bottoms of the valleys contained dashing streams and little villages made of wooden houses huddling together. Every village had its church spire. The mountainsides were strewn with spring flowers. There were cows among the tall grasses, cows with solemn bells about their necks which donged as they moved. It looked like Switzerland. I know Switzerland well, or did on my own time track. My years in the embassy at Brussels had been well spent. I learnt to speak French and German fluently, and had passed as much leave as I could travelling round Europe. Switzerland had become my favourite country. So I walked into the town. A board on the outskirts gave its name as Sécheron, and listed times of Holy Mass. And a sizable inn proclaimed itself to be the Hôtel de Jean. The exterior was studded with chamois horns and antlers of deer. What gave me a thrill? Why, outside the low door, 2 men were unloading something from a cart. The carcass of a bear. I'd never seen that before. What was more, I could understand what the men were saying. Although their accents were strange, their French was perfectly comprehensible. As soon as I entered a cheerful low room with oil lamps burning, I was greeted by the host. He asked me a lot of suspicious questions, and eventually I was shown to what must have been the poorest room in his house, over the kitchen, facing a hen run. A servant girl brought me up water. I washed and lay back on the bed to rest before dinner. I slept. When I woke, it was without any idea of time. The time slip had upset my circadian rhythms. I knew only that it was dark and had been for some while. Joe Bodenland, I told myself, you've escaped the 21st century. I was a different man, full of strength and excitement, something the innkeeper had said when I made apologies for possessing no luggage had begun to tip my mood. He said, General Bonaparte had a lot to answer for. He may be safely out of the way again, but a lot of decent people now have no homes. He'd taken me for some kind of refugee from the Napoleonic Wars. The wars had finished in 1815 with Napoleon's banishment to St. Helena, so the date was sometime shortly after that. You think I could take such knowledge calmly? Mina, will you ever hear these tapes? Don't you see, as far as I knew, I was the first man ever to be displaced in time, though no doubt the time slips were making a regular thing of it. I remembered reading the old nursery classic, Herbert G. Wells's The Time Machine, but Wells's time traveller had gone ahead in time. How much nicer to go back. The past was safe. I was back in history. I went downstairs to demand supper. Men were drinking there by a fire, beneath a cuckoo clock. There were tables, 2 empty, 2 occupied. One of the occupied tables contained a man and woman and child, tucking into great slabs of meat. At the other occupied table sat a lean-visaged but elegant man in dark clothes, reading a paper by candlelight as he ate. Ordinarily I'd have chosen an empty table, but I went over to the solitary man and said, "May I sit at your table?" For a moment I thought my accent had not been understood. Then he said, "I can't stop you sitting here," and lowered his head to his paper again. I sat down. The innkeeper's daughter offered me a choice of trout or venison. I ordered the trout with white wine to accompany it. She was back promptly with a chilled wine and bread rolls with crisp brown crust and thick doughy interior, which I broke and ate greedily. How heady was my excitement, tasting that historic food. "May I offer you a glass of wine?" I said to my table companion. He had an earthenware jug of water by his side. "You may offer, sir, and I may refuse. The social contract countenances both actions." "My action may be more mutually beneficial than yours." Possibly my answer pleased him. He nodded, and I summoned the girl to bring another glass. My hesitant companion said, "May I drink to your health without necessarily wishing to listen to your conversation? You'll think me discourteous, but perhaps I may excuse myself by explaining that it is the discourtesy of grief. I'm sorry to hear that you have cause for grief. Some find distraction welcome at such times. Distraction? All my life I've been a man who's scorned distraction. There's work to be done in the world. So much to be found out. He checked himself abruptly, lifted his glass to me, and took a sip from it. How good that wine tasted, if only because I secretly thought, what a rare old vintage I must be quaffing, laid down no doubt before the Battle of Trafalgar. I said, I'm older than you, sir, old enough to discover that finding out often leads to less pleasurable states of mind than mere ignorance. Ha! He said, I find that an ignorant point of view. I perceive, nevertheless, you are a man of culture and a foreigner. Why do you stay in Cheshire and deny yourself the pleasures of Geneva? I like the simple life. I should be in Geneva now, he said. I arrived there too late, after sunset, and found the gates of the city shut, confound it. Otherwise, I'd be at my father's house. Again an abrupt halt to his speech. The girl brought me soup and then my trout. My companion took this opportunity to hide himself in his papers, so I listened to the talk of the travellers about me, hoping for a bit of instant history. But were they talking about the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars? Were they talking about the increasing industrialization of the times? Were they talking about the first steamship crossing the Atlantic? Were they talking about Walter Scott or Lord Byron or Goethe or Metternich? Were they talking about the slave trade or the Congress of Vienna? All matters which I judged to be vital and contemporary. Did they spare one word for that new American nation across the Atlantic? No, they didn't. They talked about the latest murder, and about a woman, a maid-servant, who was to be tried for the murder in Geneva the next day. As I set my knife and fork down, I caught the gloomy eye of my table companion and ventured to say, "You'll be in Geneva tomorrow, in time to see this wretched woman brought to justice, I presume." His face took on severe lines. Anger glowed in his eyes. "Justice, you say? What do you know of the case that you prejudge this lady's guilt beforehand? Why should you be so anxious that she should hang? What injury did she ever do you? Or any living soul, for that matter?" "I must apologize. I see you know the lady personally." Shrinking back in his chair, he seemed to become prey to some inner conflict. "About her head hangs purest innocence. Deepest guilt lies heavy on the shoulders." I didn't catch his last words. I rose, bid him good evening, and went outside to stand in the road and enjoy the sense of darkness and the sight of the moon. The sound of a running stream invited me over to a bridge. Standing there in shade, I observed the man and woman who had also been eating at the hotel emerge with their child. He said, "I wonder if Justine Moritz will sleep peacefully tonight." They both chuckled and passed on down the road. Justine Moritz. I divined that they spoke of the woman who was on trial for her life. As I stood on the bridge, the door of the hotel was again thrown open. A figure emerged, pulling a cloak about him. It was my melancholy friend. An accordion sounded within the hotel, and I guessed that the distractions of music might have driven him outside. He paced about with arms folded. Once he threw them wide in a gesture of protest. He looked in every way a man distraught. Although I felt sorry for him, that prickliness in his manner made me reluctant to reveal myself. Of a sudden he made up his mind. He said something aloud. Something about a devil, I thought, and then he began striding away as if his life depended on it. I followed at a suitable distance. The way he went led downhill. The road curved, and I emerged from a copse to confront a splendid panorama. There was Lake Geneva, and there, not far distant, lay the spires and roofs of Geneva. It was a city I had loved in my time. Now, how it was shrunken! The moonlight lent it enchantment, of course, but what a poky place it looked, lying by the lakeside in the clear night. Romantic behind its walls, yes, but nothing to the great city I'd known. We moved down the hill, my quarry and I. We went on down the winding road for about 2 miles, finishing at the quayside, where he rapped smartly on a door. I watched as he engaged a man who led him down to a boat. They climbed in, and the man began to haul away at his oars. The boat slipped through shadow, and then could be seen heading across the lake, already slightly obscured by the tenuous mist. Without thinking, I went to the edge of the quay. At once a man came up to me, bearing a dim lantern, and said, "Are you requiring a ferry to the other side of the lake, good sir?" Why not? The chase was on. In no time we'd arranged terms. We climbed down to his fishing boat, and were pushing off against the stonework. I told him to douse his lantern and follow the other boat. "I expect you're acquainted with a gentleman in the other vessel, sir," my oarsman said. "I know his name," I said boldly, "but I'm surprised that you should." "The family is well known in these parts, good sir. He's young Victor Frankenstein, his famous father's son." Frankenstein's boat moored at the Plain Palais quay, on the other side of sleeping Geneva. 4 small sailing boats, sails drooping and oars plying, moved out from a tiny wooden jetty as we moved in. Frankenstein, the Frankenstein, walked briskly, and I followed briskly. Despite the peace of the early night, lightning was flickering about the horizon. Beyond Plain Palais, the horizon includes Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in the Alps. The lightning bathed the peak in intricate figures, which seemed to grow brighter as clouds rolled up and hid the moon. The thunder helped to camouflage the noise of my steps. We were now climbing fairly steeply into the mountains. He paused at one point on a low hill and cried aloud, and perhaps not without a touch of relish for the dramatic, characteristic of his age, "William, dearest little brother, close by this spot wast thou murdered, and thy dear innocence cast down." A side view of his face was reminiscent of profiles seen on coins and medals, for his features were clear-cut and sharp, and one has to have some distinction to appear on a medal. This clarity, aided by his youth, made him handsome, though there was about the handsomeness something of the coldness of a coin. His features were a little too set. Rain began to fall in large, heavy drops. Over to the northwest, the dark bulk of the Jura was flickeringly lit. The lake became an intermittent sheet of fire. The world was full of noise, dazzling light, blinding darkness, torrential rain. Frankenstein walked on more briskly, still climbing, picking his way carelessly, so that he could keep his face turned up as much as possible to the source of the storm. He was shouting aloud. I was about to break from sheltering rock when I saw him stop aghast, and raise one arm in a gesture of self-protection. In that broken place, rocks and shattered boulders lay in a half-circle, ruinous pines growing among them. My immediate thought was that Frankenstein had encountered a bear, and might at any moment come dashing back and discover me. I peered through the rain, and saw a sight I will never forget. Frankenstein was backing away, still holding that defensive gesture. His jaw hung open, and he was near enough for me to see the rain dashing from his face, when lightning showed him at all. Before him, a monstrous shape had emerged from a clump of shattered pines. It was no bear. In most respects it was human in shape, but gigantic in stature, and there seemed nothing of the human being in the way it suddenly paced forward from the trees. The lightning came again in a tremendous stroke of thunder, and I was staring at Frankenstein's monster. I slipped to my knees in extreme terror, still staring ahead, never daring even to blink, though the rain poured down my forehead and over my staring eyeballs. There was another streak of lightning overhead. Frankenstein had slumped back against a tree trunk, his head lolling back as if he was about to faint. His monster, the creature he had created, was striding towards him. Then blackness again, Then more lightning. The gigantic figure had passed by Frankenstein as if the latter did not exist, but it was coming towards me. I saw that its arms didn't swing properly as it walked. But oh, how fast it walked! More lightning. The abominable thing took a tremendous leap. It was above me on the rocks, and then it sprang into the darkness behind. For a moment I heard its footsteps, and something between a walk and a run. Then it was gone. I was left crouching in the rain. I'd seen Frankenstein's monster. There was no mistaking it. Of its face I had no clear idea. 21st century 4D representations had prepared me for something horrific. Yet my impression was of features more frightening than strictly horrifying. I could not recall the face. The light was so confusing, the monster's movements so fast, that I had a memory only of an abstraction of sculptured bone. After watching Victor Frankenstein walk towards his father's home, I came through Geneva and back to Cheshuron and my automobile. The Felder was as I'd left it. I climbed in and put this account in my portable tape memory. Two things I wanted above all. One of them was money, for I knew old systems of currency were in operation throughout the 19th century. The second thing I'd found in a coffee shop by looking at a newspaper, the day's date. It was May the 23rd, 1816. Before I describe the trial of Justine Moritz, I must set down what I know about Frankenstein in the hope of clarifying my mind. The little I know is little enough. Victor Frankenstein is the eponymous central character of a novel by Mary Shelley. He amalgamated parts of human bodies to create a monster, which he then brought to life. The monster wreaked destruction on him and his house. I remember reading Mary's novel as a child, when it made a great impression on me, but the deplorable plagiarizations put out by the mass media have obliterated my memory of the original details. Although I know that the novel was published in the 19th century, the actual date escapes me. The author was a wife of the romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, but little of her life comes back to memory. Also, I had the impression that Victor Frankenstein was purely an invented character. However, recent events have somewhat shaken my preconceptions of probability. The trial of Justine Moritz began at 11. It was my fortune to sit next to a man who delighted in explaining the nuances of the case to a foreigner. He pointed out the benches where the Frankenstein family sat. They were noticeable enough, while the rest of the courtroom was filled with excited anticipation. Covert but gloating, the faces of the Frankensteins were all gloomy. First came old Syndic Alphonse Frankenstein, bent of shoulder, grey of hair, but his gaze as he looked about the court was still commanding. As my companion informed me, he had held many important posts in Geneva and was a counsellor, as his father and grandfather had been before him. The counsellor was consoled by Elizabeth Lavenza, Victor Frankenstein's fiancée, who sat next to him. I thought she was startlingly beautiful, even in her grief, with her fair hair tucked under a dainty mourning bonnet, and her slim, upright figure. My companion said that it was well known that she would marry Victor soon, and come into a deal of money. Victor sat on her other side. He was pale and composed, his features rigidly set. He held his head defiantly lifted, as if he wished no man to see him in dejection. Next to Victor was his brother Ernest, slender and rather dandyish in his dress, although, like the rest of his family, he was in deep mourning. The two brothers were present in court because of the foul murder of their younger brother William, who had been found strangled. "Poor little lad, only 6.5 years old," said my companion. "They do say he was sexually assaulted, but the family's trying to keep it hushed up." "Where was the child murdered? At home?" No, outside the city, up in the hills, where he was playing with his brother Ernest, out by Plain Palais, towards Mont-Salève." Then I understood Frankenstein's quest in the storm of the previous night. He'd been seeking out the spot on which his little brother was strangled, and we had encountered the murderer there. I could pay no attention as my companion pointed out the Clervals, a wealthy merchant family. Clerval was a close friend of Victor's, and many other notables. Victor turned just once to nod to Henry Clerval. Justine Moritz was led into the box. She was extremely young, a rather plain girl, but with the radiance of youth on her face, although that radiance was well subdued by her present predicament. She spoke up properly when questioned. Despite this and excellent character witnesses, among them Elizabeth Lavenza, who delivered an impassioned plea on her maid's behalf, Justine stood condemned by one piece of circumstantial evidence. A locket containing a picture of her late mistress had been found in her belongings, a locket which the child William had been wearing only the day before the murder. The girl could not explain how the locket came to be among her clothes, and it was clear that her protestations of innocence were in vain. The feeling of the court was almost a tangible thing. Something vile had happened, and someone had to pay for it. Justine was captive. Justine must pay. Only I and one other person in that courtroom knew the truth, knew that the hand which had dispatched William had been neither a female hand nor a male one, but the hand of a terrible neuter thing. Whereas Elizabeth was composed, though pale, Victor became increasingly nervous, rubbing his forehead and his lips with a handkerchief, staring about him in a distraught fashion. Would he rise and declare his knowledge? But what could he say that would find credence here? Nobody else had seen his monster. Such a tale as he would have to tell would be instantly dismissed, the court being in the frame of mind that it was. Victor could bear it no longer. He stood up, pushed past brother and friends, and dashed from the courtroom. Elizabeth stood up, a commanding figure with one hand half extended, and watched him go. The proceedings continued. When all had been said that could be said, the judge made a brief summary, the ballots were cast, and the verdict was solemnly delivered. Justine Moritz was found guilty of the murder of little William Frankenstein, and was sentenced to be hanged within the space of 2 days. These matters rolled round and round in my brain like a thunderstorm. Later, as I drove along the edge of the lake eastwards, I was hardly conscious of the placid scenery. A steady rain began to fall. Perhaps it prevented me from noting how rapidly the season seemed to have advanced. The trees were now heavy with dark green foliage. The corn was already ripening, and the vines in full leaf, with bunches of grapes hanging thickly. Frankenstein was no Faust, exchanging his immortal soul for power. Frankenstein wanted only knowledge, was, if you like, only doing a bit of research. He wanted to put the world to rights. He wanted a few answers to a few riddles. Whatever previous generations made of it, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was regarded by the 21st century as the first novel of the scientific revolution, and incidentally as the first novel of science fiction. Her novel had remained relevant over 2 centuries, simply because Frankenstein was the archetype of the scientist whose research, pursued in the sacred name of increasing knowledge, takes on a life of its own, and causes untold misery before being brought under control. Was there some immutable cosmic law which decreed that man's good intentions should always thunder back about his head, like slates from a roof? My dim recollection was that there was discussion of such questions in Mary Shelley's novel. I needed desperately to get hold of a copy of the book. But when had it first been published? I couldn't recall. There were some fragments of my education in English literature which did return to me, and that was why I was driving eastwards along Lake Geneva. I thought I had a pretty good idea of where at least one copy of the novel would certainly be. When I saw the next auberge coming up, I drew into the side of the road, put on my raincoat, and walked along to it. I'd bought a few items of clothing that morning before the trial began, and no longer looked quite such a time-traveller. At the inn, they set before me a soup with dumplings in it, followed by a great white sausage on a small alp of potato and onion rings. This I washed down with lager from a great stein as monumentally carved as the Parthenon itself. As I picked my teeth and smiled to myself, I glanced at the newspaper furled on its stick beside my plate. The paper was dated Monday, 26th August, 1816. But this was May. At first my mind couldn't adjust to the missing 3 months. I sat stupidly with the paper in my hands, staring down at it. Then I commenced a tremulous search through its pages, almost as if I expected to find details of a time-slip between Geneva and where I now was. Losing 3 months is a far nastier experience than being jolted back 2 centuries. Centuries are cold, impersonal things. Months are things you live with, and 3 of them had just been whipped from under me. I paid my bill in thoughtful fashion, and with a trembling hand. When I stood at the doorway, hesitating to dash into the rain, I could see that the landscape had moved with the date. The grapes that hung over mine host's door were turning a dusky shade as the juice ripened in their skins. August was here. The auberge owner joined me at the door and stared with contempt at the sky. "I take it you're a foreigner, sir. This is the worst summer as we've had in these parts for a century or more." "Rain or no rain, I must get on my way. Can you tell me of an English poet staying in these parts?" He grinned broadly at me. "Bless you, sir, I can tell you of 2 English poets. England must have as many poets as soldiers, so liberally does she scatter them hereabouts. They're staying not 3 leagues from this village." "2 of them? Do you know their names?" "Why, sir, one's the great Lord Byron, probably the most famous poet in the world. And the other? He's not famous." "Shelley, is it?" "Yes, I believe that's the name, Shelley. He's got a couple of women with him. They're down along the road here by the lake's edge. Ask for the Villa Diodati." The rain had stopped. Cloud lay thick across the lake, hiding the mountain peaks beyond. I stood under trees, surveying the stone walls and vines of the Villa Diodati. And it came on me with a start that a young man was regarding me over the barrel of a pistol. He was a handsome young man, with a head of well-oiled reddish hair. He wore a green jacket, grey trousers, and high-calf boots, and had a bold air about him. "I'd be obliged if you'd cease to point that antique at me," I said. "Why so? The tourist shooting season opened today. I've bagged 3 already," he said. "You've only to come close enough to my hide, and I let fly. I'm one of the best marksmen in Europe, and you're possibly the biggest grouse in Europe." But he lowered his pistol and came forward 2 paces. "Thank you. It would be embarrassing to be shot before we were introduced." He was still not looking particularly friendly. "Then be off into the undergrowth, my feathered friend. It makes me feel more than somewhat persecuted to have items of the British public lurking about my property, particularly when most of them haven't read 2 lines of my verse together." Taking the binoculars from round my neck, I proffered them, saying, "You observe how amateur my lurking was. Not only did I not conceal myself, but I didn't use my chief lurking weapon. Have you ever seen the like of these, sir?" He tucked the gun into the top of his trousers. That was a good sign. Then he took the binoculars and peered at me through them. Clicking his tongue in approval, he swerved to take in the lake. "Let's see if Dr. Polly is up to anything he shouldn't be with our young Mistress Mary." I saw him focus on a boat which lay almost stationary beneath its single sail, fairly close to shore. But I wanted to take him in while his eyes were off me. Being so close to Lord Byron was something like being close to big game, a lion encountered at the foot of Kilimanjaro. Although not a tall man, he had considerable stature. His shoulders were broad, his face handsome. You could see his genius in his eyes and lips. Only his skin, as I inspected him from fairly close quarters, was pallid and blotchy. There were grey hairs among his auburn locks. He studied the sailing boat for a while, smiling to himself. Then he chuckled. Tasso keeps them apart, though their fingers meet on the pillows of his pastoral. The triumph of learning over concupiscence. Polly itches for her, but they continue to construe. Red blood is nothing before a blue stocking. I could make out two figures in the boat, one male, one female. Do you refer to Mary Shelley, sir? Byron looked quizzically at me, holding the glasses out, but just beyond my grasp. Mary Shelley? No, sir, I refer to Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. She's Shelley's mistress, not his wife. I thought that much was common knowledge. What do you take 'em for, a pair of Christians? Though neither Shelley nor she are pagans, that's certain. Even now, Mary improves her mind at the expense of my doctor's body. Perhaps you'll honour me by joining me in a glass of claret. We can always shoot each other later if needs be. I hope not, as long as the rain holds off. You'll find, if you're long here, sir, that in this terrible spot the rain holds up, but seldom off. Every day contains more weather than a week in Scotland, and weeks in Scotland can drag on for centuries, believe me. What a spellbinder Byron was. We sat and drank in his villa before a smouldering fire while he conversed. The range of his talk was beyond me. Even when not particularly profound, it was salted with allusions, and the connections he drew between things I'd hitherto regarded as unconnected were startling. At least I gathered a few facts, which drifted down like leaves amid the mellow August of his talk. He lived in the Villa Diodati with his doctor, Polly, the Italian, Polidori, and his retinue. The Shelley ménage was established close by, just a grape stamp across the vineyard, as Byron put it, the Villa Chapuis. My fellow reprobate and exile, that was how he designated Shelley, was established with two young women, Mary Godwin and her half-sister Claire Claremont. "This is my present abode," he said, tapping his head. "How much longer I shall stay in it and not go out of it, who knows? There seems to be some poetry rattling about in there, rather as air rattles about in the bowels, but to get it out with a proper report, that's the trick." As I was about to open my mouth, the outer door swung open, and in bounced two hounds, followed by a slender young man shaking raindrops from his head. He scattered drops about from a blue cap he carried, while the dogs sent flurries of water everywhere. Byron jumped up with a roar and offered the newcomer a plaid rug on which to dry his hair. The roar made the dogs scatter, barking. It was plain how pleased the two men were to see one another. Taking my arm, Byron said, "My dear Bodenland, you must be acquainted with my fellow reprobate and exile." So I was introduced to Percy Bysshe Shelley. Yes, Byron introduced me to Shelley. The younger man was habited youthfully, in black jacket and trousers, over which he had a dripping cape. He gave me a dazzling smile. Shelley was all electricity, where Byron was all beef, if I can say that without implying lack of admiration for Byron. He was taller than Byron, but stooped slightly, whereas Byron's demeanour was almost soldierly at times. The two poets talked together, the dogs slunk back into the room, the fire flickered, the rain fell. The world seemed very small. Byron slouched back solidly in his chair, but Shelley never kept still. A servant was summoned. The laudanum bottle was brought out. Byron tipped it gently into his brandy. Shelley consented to having a draught in wine. I took another glass of wine myself. "Ah, a man can drown in the stuff," said Byron, appreciatively sipping. No, you need a whole lake to drown properly," said Shelley. "In this stuff you float." And he rose and began to dance round the room. The dogs yapped and growled about his heels. He ignored them, but Byron lurched to his feet with a bellow. Get these manky hounds out of my room." As the servant was kicking them out, Mary Godwin entered, and I found myself flushing, partly with the wine, no doubt, but mainly with the agonizing exhilaration of confronting the author of Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. She went over to Shelley and gave him a book, telling him that Claire Claremont was sitting by their little son, William. Wilmouse, she called him. Shelley started to question her about Tasso, but Byron called her over to him. "You may give me a kiss, dear Mary, since it's soon to be your birthday." She did kiss him, but somewhat dutifully. He patted her and said to me, "Here you see the advantages of heredity nobly exemplified. This young lady, Mr. Bowdenland, is the product of the union of two of the great minds of our time, the philosopher, William Godwin, and Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the great philosophical female minds. So we have here beauty and wisdom united, to everyone's great advantage." "Do not let Lord Byron prejudice you against me, sir," said Mary, smiling. She was petite. She was fair and rather bird-like, with brilliant eyes and a small, wistful mouth. As with Shelley, she was irresistible when she smiled, for her whole countenance lit up. She gave you her enjoyment. But she was much more still than Shelley, and on the whole very silent, and in her silence was a mournful quality. I could see why Shelley loved her, and why Byron teased her. One thing struck me about her immediately. She was amazingly young. Later I saw by a date in a book that she was not yet 18. The thought went through my mind, she can't help me. It must be years yet before she will come to write her masterpiece. The poets began a conversation on the advantages of lunar life. Mary stood meekly beside me, listening. Then she said to me, quietly, so as not to disturb the talk, "We shall eat mutton tonight, or Lord Byron and Polidori will, for Percy and I avoid meat. You must join us if you will. I'm just going to see if the cook is attending to the vegetables." Nothing pleased me more than to be allowed to take supper with them. They were interested in my opinions, but not in my circumstances, so that I didn't have to invent any tales about my past. Polidori came down to supper and sat next to me without saying anything. He and I were eating heartily when Byron threw down his fork and cried, "Oh, for the horrors of polite society again! At least they knew how to treat meat. This is a mockery of mutton." "Ah," said Shelley, looking up from his carrots, "a lampoon. In a few generations all mankind will be vegetarian. Once it is generally realized that the animals are such close kin to us, then meat-eating will be disdained as too near to cannibalism for comfort. Can you imagine what a civilizing effect that will have on the multitude? 100 years from now, the march of the physical sciences— Oh, Albie, you should have talked to old Erasmus Darwin about that subject. He foresaw the time when steam would invade every domain, just as it invaded this mutton. Steam is the basis of all the present-day improvements. Mind you, it's only the very beginning of a revolutionary improvement in all things. We who have witnessed steam are now harnessing gas as another powerful servant, and we are merely the precursors of generations who will harness the great life force of electricity." "Oh, well, that's pretty good going," said Byron. "That's air, water, and fire. What are our enlightened descendants going to do about the fourth element, earth? Will they find some use for it, other than burying mouldy bodies in it?" "The earth will be free to everyone," said Shelley. "Don't you see? Mary, you explain. Were the elements as slaves, then for the first time in history, slavery will be abolished. Human servitude will disappear, for servitors in the forms of machines, powered by steam and electricity, will take over. And that means that a day of universal socialism will dawn. For the first time, there will be no masters and inferiors. All will be equal." Byron laughed and stared down at his boots. "I doubt God ever intended that. He gives no sign of it." "It's not God's intentions. It's man's intentions. As long as man's intentions can be made to be good— It's man that has to put nature right, you know, and not vice versa. I see the time coming when the human race will rule as it should rule, as benevolent gardeners, with a great garden in their care. Don't you think mankind will have to change its basic nature a little before that happens, Percy? Mary said timidly. Her eyes had rarely left his face, although he was now tramping about the room, gesticulating as he talked. What I'm saying is that machines will free all men, all the mute inglorious Miltons of Gray's poem. Youth will not be shackled, because the distortions of the present order will be abolished, utterly abolished. He stood over Byron, searching Byron's face. For all his dilettante airs, Byron too was absorbed in the theme. Is it possible that machinery will banish oppression? He asked. The question is whether machines strengthen the good or the evil in man's nature. So far, the evidence is not encouraging, and I suspect that new knowledge may lead to new oppression. Socialism will change all that, Shelley said. Just remember, it's the present order which is unnatural. We're working towards a more natural order, where inequality is done away with. By the time you and I are old men... I'll shot myself before that. By the time this century is finished, the whole planet... well, little Wilmouse will live to see it, let's hope. There are entirely new powers hovering in the air, condensing in the future, lurking in the minds of man, which can be summoned, as Prospero summoned Ariel. Don't forget he summoned Caliban too, said Byron. What happens if these new powers are seized by those in power already, who after all are in the best position to seize them? I suppose it's possible. Man may enslave the elements, but remain himself a slave. I said, the greater the complexity of systems, the more danger of something going wrong, and the less chance individual will has of operating on the systems for good. First, the systems become impersonal. Then they seem to take on a mind of their own. Then they become positively malignant. Silence for a moment while we all gazed meditatively at the floor. Then we're heading for a world full of Frankenstein monsters, Mary, exclaimed Byron, slapping his leg. For God's sake, let's take another drink, or shoot the dogs, or call in Claire to dance the fandango, rather than indulge ourselves in this misery. Is not the past of the human race gloomy enough for you, without supping upon the imaginary horrors of its future? So, was the novel then written by this slender girl of 18? But the slender girl of 18 was answering Lord Byron. Milton's sympathies would be with you, Albie. Let no man seek henceforth to be foretold what shall befall him or his children. But my feelings are different, if I may state them. Our generation must take on the task of thinking about the future. There are changes in the world to which we must not be passive, or we shall be overwhelmed by them. When knowledge becomes formulated into a science, then it does take on a life of its own, often alien to the human spirit that conceived it. Oh, yes, I said, and always the pretense that the innovating spirit is so noble and so good, whereas the cellars of creativity are often stuffed with corpses. Don't talk to me about corpses, cried Shelley, jumping up. Who knows but they may be lined up outside that very wall, waiting to flock in on us. He pointed melodramatically, running a finger along in the air ahead of him. I know about corpses. Mortality. That's always the stumbling block. Your Frankenstein was correct in his basic idea, Mary. He sought first to create a race free from the bounds of ordinary human weakness. Oh, would I had been so created! How I'd stalk the world! He gave a great shriek and rushed from the room. Byron pulled a funny face at Mary. Think yourself lucky he don't eat meat, ma'am, or there's no knowing what he'd be up to. Percy's so ethereal. I fear the world invisible is more visible to him than to the rest of us. I'd better go and calm him down. Mary, dear, One night when I've made a better meal than I did tonight. I plan to go a little berserk, too, in order to have your solace." She smiled. "Oh, Claire will look after you, Lord Byron." That night I slept in Chapuis. Byron would not have me in the larger house, claiming that the dogs would never tolerate my presence without howling all night. So I slept in a little attic room which smelt of apples, my head not very far away from the dream-troubled heads of Shelley and his mistress. Next morning I was awoken by their baby crying. As I climbed from my cramped couch, I realized that my hope of helping Justine was dead. But there was one thing I could do. I could eradicate Frankenstein's monster. If I could borrow a copy of Mary's book, I could map its route, ambush it, kill it. What would Frankenstein do then? Would he make a second creature? Should I anticipate that it was my duty to eradicate not only the monster, but the author of monsters? I shelved that problem for a later date. One thing I'd already accepted. I had accepted the equal reality of Mary Shelley and her creation, Victor Frankenstein, just as I had accepted the equal reality of Victor and his monster. Trunks were standing half-packed. Claire was rushing madly about looking for her bonnet. Mary was trying to comfort Wilmouse, who was crying loudly, and looked, I thought, rather a little shriveled thing. Occasionally I caught glimpses of Shelley through the vines, skipping about between the two houses and the landing stage where their boats were moored. There were a collection of rowing boats and a masted boat with a deck, which Claire referred to as the schooner. The weather was not too bad. A watery sun had come through, and wind was driving the mist away. "We're all going to sail round to Melières while it's fine," Claire said. "I shall take my lute." If they went sailing, there would be no chance to speak privately to Mary. In 2 days the Shelley party was leaving here, making for Geneva and thence to London. I crept back upstairs to my little room and spoke my account of the previous day's events into my journal. I sat for a long while, gazing beyond it. I cannot say what I saw there. At last I realized that the voice of the Shelley party had faded long since. My room was on the landward side of Chapuis, so in any case I could not have watched the schooner depart. All was silence, except for the creaking tick of a clock. In melancholy mood I went downstairs. There sat Mary by the empty grate. Beside her was a wooden cradle from which she had taken her baby. She held the child in her arms, having undone the ribbon of her blouse and put a small breast to his mouth. She was rocking him gently as he fed. When she saw me, she smiled and put a finger to her lips, motioning silence. She made no attempt to conceal her appealing expanse of breast. Uncertain about Regency conventions, I was both embarrassed and charmed, but she gestured that I was to stay. The baby fell asleep at its feed. The nipple popped wetly from its mouth. "I thought you'd sailed on the schooner with the others." "I stayed because little Wilmouse is unwell," she said, "and he'll have trouble enough when we're on our way back to England." "I also stayed because I understood you wished to speak with me." "That was very considerate of you." "It was not so much consideration as intuition. Something tells me that you visit me with some strange intelligence." "Mary, if I may call you that, yes, I have indeed some strange intelligence, but I know you're a girl with a great deal of intuition, as well as consideration, and what you say makes my difficult task easier." I was head and shoulders taller than she, my head knocking against the low rafters. What I couldn't say was that as we two stood together in the shadowy parlour, I fell considerably within her spell. Impulsively I said, "You spoke little during our talk last night, yet I know you had much to contribute." "It was my place to listen, and I wished to listen. Shelley was not at his best, yet he always talked so beautifully." "Yes, he is very optimistic about the future." Perhaps he makes it appear so." A silence fell between us. The baby slept by her feet. Large intangible sensations seemed to rise round us. I could hear the clock ticking again, and the tick of my heart. "Come and sit by the window with me," she said. "Tell me what it is you wish to say. Is it something about Shelley?" "No, it's something touching on our conversation last night. Although, like Shelley, I'm not a believer in the Christian religion, as no intelligent person can be in our day, I give strong credence to spirits. Until you enlighten me, and perhaps even after that, I shall regard you as some kind of spirit." "That might be the best way to look at it. Maybe I can never convince you that I'm other than a spirit, for what I have to tell you is this, that I've come from 200 years in the future to speak to you, to sit here by this window and talk as we talk now." Seen in the soft green light of the window, speaking with her serious, calm air, Mary Shelley was beautiful to behold. There might be a melancholy here, but there was none of Shelley's madness, none of Byron's moodiness. She said with a half laugh, "Oh, you must have documents to prove your claim, to show at whatever unlikely temporal frontier post you came through on your way here." "Of course I do, and better than documents. But the document that most interests me, Mary, is your novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus." "About that, you'll have to give me more details," she said calmly, gazing at my face. "How you've heard of my story I do not know, for it lies unfinished upstairs, although I began it in May. Indeed, I may never complete it, now that we have to move back to England to sort out our difficulties there." "You will finish it, you will, I know as much, for I come from a time when your novel is generally acknowledged as a masterpiece of literature and prophetic insight, a time when Frankenstein is as familiar a name to the literate as Gulliver or Robinson Crusoe is to you." "My story is famous?" "It is famous, and your name is honored." She put a hand to her forehead. "Mr. Bodenland, Joe, let's go and walk by the water's edge. I need some physical activity to prove I'm not dreaming." She was shaking. I took her arm as we passed through the door. She closed it and leant against it, looking up at me in an unconsciously provocative attitude. "Can it really be, as you say, that fame, that vicarious life in another's breath, will be mine in the years to come? And Shelley's? I'm sure his fame can never die. Shelley's fame has always been secure, and his name forever linked with Lord Byron's. But your fame ranks with Shelley's. He's regarded as one of the foremost poets of science, and you as the first novelist of science. Shall I live to write more than one novel, then? Yes, you will. And when shall I die? And dear Shelley, shall we die young?" "You will not die before your names are known." "And will we marry? You know he pursues other women in his ever-questing way." "You will marry. Your name goes down into the future as Mary Shelley." She closed her eyes. Tears welled behind her eyelids and trickled down her cheeks. I put my arms about her, and we remained half leaning against the sun-blistered door. She laughed and cried, and I laughed with her. There was a union, a chemical bond between us, which nature seemed to acknowledge and conspire with, for the wind dropped, and the sun blazed forth, and the great hills with their snowy caps shone forth in magnificence. Without conscious intention, I took her in my arms and kissed her. She responded before breaking away. "Come, my messenger, who brings me such reason for deep happiness. We will swim in the lake. The water's deep and cold as a grave here. Do you mind? We'll turn our backs to each other, and so be polite while we strip." She entered the water, with a small cry at its chill. Splashing her limbs to get used to the cold, she turned and looked at me with a hint of mischief as I stood naked staring at her. Our gaze met and became an eternal thing. That's how I see her now, turning to look over a white shoulder with the placid expanse of lake about her. I ran forward and dashed into the water with a skimming dive. After our swim, we ran back to the little villa, Laughing and clutching our clothes, she found me a towel upstairs. I didn't use it, nor she hers. Instead, we lay on the bed together, embracing, mouth to mouth. Time and the great day fluttered round our bodies. There was a moment later when I found a willow leaf stuck to her still moist haunches. I set it carefully on the edition of Sophocles by her bed, intending to retrieve it later. I shall keep it, since it comes from enchanted ground. Enchanted indeed. You and I are under an enchantment, Joe, she said. We don't exist in the same world. Both of us are spirits, though you kiss my flesh. And we are swallowed up from the world, carried to this room, to a glade of an enchanted forest, magnificent and unbounded, where stand groves of pine and walnut and chestnut. Nothing can harm us here. The forests are infinite. The sun will never swing away from that casement window, for we've abolished time at a stroke, my dearest spirit. Ah, Mary, Mary Shelley, how dear you were and are, beyond all women. And yet what was possible then was only possible because we were mere phantoms in the world, or so we saw it, and scarcely less than phantoms to each other. But the solid Swiss world was no phantom, nor would the solar system cease forging steadily through interstellar space. The sun did swing away from our casement, for all that Mary said, for all our forgetting of time, and the baby awoke and cried. Mary, giving me a languorous look, dressed herself carelessly and descended the stairs. I remember how her dress lit the stairwell, reflecting onto the wall the sunbeams that fell on it as she descended. This is what she said when I asked her how she came to write her novel. It began as a horror story in the mode of Mrs. Radcliffe. One evening in Diodati, Polly, Dr. Polidori, brought us a collection of ghostly tales and read the most gory bits aloud to us. Polidori decided that we should have a competition, and each of us write a macabre tale. The three men began on something, although Shelley has little patience with prose. I alone could not start. I suppose I was too shy, or perhaps I was too ambitious. I was impatient of inventing little frights like Polidori. What I desired was a grand conception, one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature. I was finally inspired by the talk between the poets. Shelley and Byron were discussing Erasmus Darwin's experiments and speculations on the future, and on the possibility of revivifying corpses by electric shock treatments, provided mortification had not set in. Shelley said that one big engine with varying outlets of varying capacities, according to the needs of each organ, could be used, and so they went on developing this idea, and I retired to my bed with these notions in my head. I slept, I dreamed, and in that dream Frankenstein was born. I saw the engine powerfully at work, its wires running to a monstrous figure about which the scientist flitted. Presently the figure sat up in its bandages. At that, the scientist who'd played God was dismayed by his handiwork, as was God with our general ancestor Adam, though with less reason. He goes away, rejecting the power he's assumed, hoping that the creature will fall back into decay. But that night, when he's asleep, the creature enters his chamber and rips back his curtains, so that he wakes up with a start to find its dreadful gaze upon him, and its hand outstretched for his throat. I also started out of my sleep, as you may imagine. Next day I set myself to writing out my dream. When I showed my few pages to Shelley, he urged me to develop the story at greater length, and to underline the idea more powerfully. The story seems to possess me. Such power makes me uneasy, and that's why I've put the manuscript by for some many days. She lay back, looking up at the little discoloured ceiling. It's a strange feeling. Perhaps it stems from a sensation that I'm in some way making a prediction of awful catastrophe, and not just telling a story. If you're from the future, then you must tell me honestly, Joe, if such a catastrophe will take place. You do have true presentiments of doom, Mary. In that way you're ahead of your age. I come from a civilization long hypnotized by the idea of its nemesis. What makes me curious is this. Do you know that there is a real Victor Frankenstein, son of a distinguished syndic of Geneva? I can't bear it if you alarm me. You know my story is an invention. I've told you so. Besides, I set my tale in the last century and not today, because that's a convention which readers like. Do you know that your characters are alive today, only a few miles down the road in Geneva? You must know, Mary. You must have read the newspapers and seen that the maidservant, Justine, was on trial for murdering one of her charges. Mary started to weep and cried that her life was difficult enough without further complications. I began to comfort her. What started as an innocent embrace grew more intent as I held her and kissed her lips, soft with crying. Percy accuses me of not being loving enough. Oh, Joe, do you find me so? Oh, Mary, I had to journey 2 centuries to find such a lover. There never was a love like ours before, dearest Mary. My dearest Joe. And so on. Why do I tear my heart by recalling our words then? In our restlessness, we walked about the house, talking, touching each other. She laughed. You know, Joe, you're my first reader. A pity you don't remember my book a little better. A pity I don't have a copy bound to present you with. How grandly I'd inscribe it. Are you going now? I nodded, too full of emotion to speak. For a long while, I could see her in the rear-view mirror, standing in the road in her long white dress, holding her child and looking after the Felder. Only when she was out of sight and I'd turned round a corner did I remember I'd left the little willow leaf from her body, lying upstairs on her Sophocles. 19th century Geneva began to seem almost a familiar place, with its thriving waterfront, avenues, narrow streets, and busy horse traffic. I had left my automobile behind a farmer's barn beyond the city walls, and was making my way to Frankenstein's house. I had resolved that I would make an alliance with him, persuade him not to create a female creature, and help him to hunt down and exterminate the creature already at large in the world. At that time I felt some sympathy with Victor Frankenstein. I could see that his situation was in some respects almost as isolated as my own. However, that feeling evaporated very soon. As I was walking down a quiet alley towards the centre of the town, 2 figures appeared some way ahead and hailed me. I stopped. They were burly fellows, and close enough for me to make out their boots, heavy clothes, and tricorn hats. One of them drew a pistol from his belt. The last thing I wanted was an interview with law officers. My dalliance with Mary Shelley had in some respects disarmed my alertness, but now I was aware of my dangerous position. As the men moved towards me, I turned and ran. Another officer was coming from behind. He was young and sturdy, with a long baton in his right hand. But I'd caught him unprepared. Before his arm came up, I charged him with a shoulder in his chest, and was past him before he sprawled on the cobbles. Heavy feet pounded behind me. I turned from the alley into a yard where 2 carts stood, one half loaded with sacks of flour. I ran towards a brick wall at the far end. As I reached it, my pursuers entered the yard and shouted to me to stop. I hauled myself up onto the top of the wall and looked back before jumping over. One of the officers was aiming his pistol at me, steadying it with both hands. He was professional enough not to have fired while we were running, and so wasting his shot. He fired even as I jumped. I fell into a lane. The ball had hit me in the leg. It was not a bad wound, but enough to make me land badly and wrench my ankle. Staggering up, I leant against the wall, panting. My pursuers swarmed into the lane and seized me. In a short while, I found myself at the local prison, pushed into a filthy, stinking room with some 24 other malefactors. How bitterly I thought that night of the happiness I had left that morning. How longingly I recalled that other bed, with a copy of Sophocles beside it and Mary in it, as I camped out on unsavoury sacks among the dregs of humanity who were my new companions. By morning I was covered in bites from a number of loathsome insects who fed better than I did. I needed attention. Though my wound from the officer's ball was not much worse than a flesh wound, it hurt me and looked bad. My trousers were caked with blood. Accordingly, without rising from my sordid bed, I lay and groaned and babbled, and altogether gave a wonderful impression of a man in extremity. A warden was called. He turned me over with his foot. I moaned. Another officer was called, and I was carried away with much clanking of keys, eventually to find myself in a small cell, where I was dumped in a negligent way onto a table. A doctor came and examined me. I moaned throughout his inspection. My wound was probed and bandaged, and then the fool of a medico bled me, evidently under the impression that it would calm a supposed fever. As they carried away a pannier of my blood, I felt almost as bad as I pretended to be. I was then dragged into a solitary cell, locked in and left, and there I stayed for 2 days. I was given some food, which by the end of the 2nd day I trained myself to eat. On the 3rd day I was marched before a prison officer. I found why I'd been arrested. With all the uncertainty in the country after the recent wars, I'd been an object of suspicion from the moment I'd arrived at the inn in Schecheron and encountered Victor Frankenstein. I was charged as a spy. My incredible vehicle had also been observed, that black horseless carriage, and accordingly I was charged also as a sorcerer. Further, my appearances and disappearances had been linked with those of Victor Frankenstein, who, I gathered, had not been seen in Geneva since he ran from the courtroom. The police suspected that Victor Frankenstein might be killed, as his younger brother had been. Accordingly, I was tentatively established as the guilty party, and to the charges of spying and sorcery was added the further charge of murder. They escorted me back to the cell. I was booted in, and the door slammed behind me. I woke before dawn some days later. I knew something was wrong. Something had woken me, but what? I sat up, huddling my blanket to my chest. Not so much a sound as a sensation that a whole spectrum of sound was missing. And then I knew. It was snowing. That was why I held my blanket about me. It was cold, whereas the cell had been stiflingly hot when I fell asleep. It was the cold that accounted for my sluggishness in detecting what was wrong. Snow was falling steadily over the prison, over Geneva in midsummer. Another time slip. I hauled myself up and peered out of the bars. I saw torches moving, less powerful than lighted matches against the first crack of gold in the eastern sky. And there was the snow, grey against grey. Then the sound very distant of a bugle, a faint smell of wood smoke, and another sound more alarming, the sound of water. Perhaps always an alarming noise for a man trapped in a small space. How long I stood there, trembling with cold and nameless apprehension, I've no idea. Panic communicates itself without words. I threw myself against the cell door and hammered and shouted, crying to be let out. Then the water hit the prison. It arrived in a great flood, a shock wave of water that could be felt and heard. A second's lull, then such a din. Shouts, screams, and the thunder of inundation. A wave must have swept across the prison yard. It struck the wall, and a great cascade burst upwards, some of it to come flying through the cell window. The shock started me hammering at my door again. The whole prison was in a confusion of sound, with the echo of slamming doors added to all the rest of the row. And worse was to come. The water that spurted through my window was a mere splash. More came welling and flooding under the door, so that I suddenly found it all about my ankles. It was icy. I jumped up on my bunk, still yelling for release. The light filtering in was enough to reveal a darkly gleaming surface of water, turbulent, continually rising. Already it was almost on a level with my straw palliasse. The yard outside must be flooded to a depth of about 3 feet. In no time, all prisoners on my level would be drowning. The water outside was already almost above our heads. Splashing through the dark flood, I was again throwing myself at the door when a key turned in its great lock, and it opened. Who set me free, warder or prisoner, I've no idea, but there was someone at least in that dreadful place who had a thought for others beside himself. The passage was a ghastly limbo between death and life, a place where men fought and screamed in semi-darkness to get out, splashing up to their crutches in fast-moving water. And it was a matter of fighting. To lose your foothold was to be trodden down. What a scene in the yard! What filth and terror and tumult! The water was littered with obstacles, and there were painful things below the water to strike oneself on. That insurmountable dread of drowning gradually subsided. The gates of the prison had been flung open. It was up to everyone to save themselves. At last I was under the shadow of the prison arch, splashing and gasping with other ill-glimpsed men. Then we were out of the prison. I caught a glimpse of a great sea stretching among the buildings, of people and animals weltering in it, before turning with the rest of the mob in a rush for higher ground. Hours later, resting myself and my battered legs in a shallow cave on a hillside, I returned to something like my senses. My first feeling was one of cheer that I had escaped from prison. The snow still fell thickly. I would prepare myself for flight later, for I was determined not to be caught again. Meanwhile, I needed warmth and food. Still in my pockets was a disposable butane lighter. All I needed was fuel, and I'd have a fire going. I hobbled out onto the hillside. Visibility was down to a few yards. I stood in a white wilderness, wondering how best to gather wood in such conditions. I rooted about the bases of small trees, enduring the descent of great slides of snow on my back and shoulders. I amassed armfuls of small twigs, which I carried back to my cave. My search took me further from base with each load. After 4 loads, I came across footprints in the snow. Like Robinson Crusoe on his island, I trembled at the sight. The prints were large and made by strongly fortified boots. So thickly was the snow falling that I knew they had only just been made, probably within the last 5 minutes. Somebody was close by me on the hillside. I could see nothing. The snow was like glaucoma. I went on, grubbing for wood. I worked my way into a stand of pines and found there several fallen branches which I was able to drag back to the cave. The fire burnt up without trouble. The warmth was welcome, although now I was nervous anew, thinking my fire would attract anything lurking at hand. I was too anxious to go looking for any birds or small animals which might be caught half frozen in the undergrowth. Instead, I crouched near my hissing flames, nursing my leg and keeping one hand close to a sturdy length of branch. When the marauder came, I glimpsed him through drifting snow and smoke. No sound. The universal white blanket saw to that. Only silence as I rose, weapon in hand, to confront him. He seemed to me huge and shaggy, his breath hanging about his face in the chilly air. Then I was struck from behind. The blow landed on my shoulder. It had been aimed at my head, but I moved at the last second, prompted by some unclassified intuition of survival. I saw his ragged, ferocious face as he paused before hurling himself at me. I brought up my branch. He caught it right in the face. He fell back, but the other man, the one I'd first seen, came running forward. I whirled my branch. He was armed with a stout length of post, which came up and broke my blow. Before I could deliver another, he'd grasped my wrist, and we were fighting face to face, nearly falling into the fire as we did so. I saw the other man getting up and tried to break and run, but they had me. I was tripped. I curled up and kicked out wildly at their shins, but I was at their mercy. They hacked me in the ribs, and then proceeded to batter me about the head. My personal space-time became as dislocated as the impersonal one. At length I did manage to roll over and sit up. After a further interval, I was able to drag myself into my little cave. I had a flimsy recollection of being afraid of getting drowned. Now I had a flimsy suspicion that I might be buried under snow and never rise again to the surface. It was the cold that forced a move. I saw then that my fire was scattered, that only a few wisps of smoke rose here and there. The 2 ruffians, escaped prisoners like myself without a doubt, had attacked me on account of my fire. To them it represented infinite riches, well worth committing murder for. I would freeze to death this night unless I had some warmth. And there was something else, a noise I recognized among the eternal wastes of silence. Recognized? What ancestral thing in me prompted me to know the cry of wolves? Working on hands and knees, I drew more branches before my little retreat and got a flame going again. There I lay, half roasted on one side, freezing on the other, in a sort of trance. If I died on this hillside, I would not even know where or when the hillside was. At some point in that dreadful night, the wolves came very close. I pushed more wood on my fire to make a brighter blaze, and at some point I was visited. I was in no fit state to move a muscle. The fire had died down, though several branches still glowed. Someone stood carelessly among the embers, as if having his flesh charred was the least of his worries. All I could see were feet and legs, and they looked enormous. The legs were clumsily encased in gaiters. In a feeble effort at self-preservation, I put up one arm to ward off a blow, but the arm fell down as if it would have nothing to do with such an idea. I could see my hand lying palm upwards, seemingly a great distance from me. Huge scarred hands thrust something into my grasp. A voice spoke to me. I thought I heard it say in deep and melancholy tones, "Here, fellow outcast from society, if thou canst survive this night, draw strength from one who did not." Then the great figure was gone, swallowed as soon as it turned into the drifting dark. So too my senses went into their own brand of night. At last I hauled myself up into a sitting position and peered about. The fire was dead, and my limbs felt as lifeless. I felt a little better, and was aware of hunger pangs in my stomach. I thought to look about on the ground near me, recalling that strange visit in the night. A dead hare lay in the snow, its neck twisted. This was the thing that did not survive the night. Someone or something had had compassion upon me. I got into action, moving more and more strongly as I sought out wood for a fresh fire. The sight of the flames leaping up did much to hearten me. Eventually I was strong enough to concentrate on tearing the hare into pieces, impaling the joints on sticks, and thrusting them into the glowing heat of my fire. I fed ravenously. I decided to strike out while I could, and hoped to find shelter. Moving with no clear sense of direction, I arrived at last at a wooden hut, set in a clearing of the forest which covered that part of the mountain. The drifts of snow against the door of the hut showed that nobody had been that way recently. After clearing away the snow, I entered the hut. Inside were a few necessities: a large bearskin, a stove, some kindling wood, a chopper, even a very hard garlic sausage hanging from a beam. Luxury indeed. In one corner hung a crucifix, with a Bible lying below. I stayed in the hut for 3 days, until the snow began to melt, dripping in stealthy drops from my roof. By that time my body was recovering, and I left the shelter and set off downhill in what I hoped was the direction of Geneva. I was eager to discover what dreadful catastrophe had overtaken this part of the world. I could only suppose that the collapse of space-time in my own day was slowly spreading outwards from source, like a bloodstain oozing across an old sheet, threatening many deep-seated continuities. The very idea raised an image of a gradual disruption of the whole fabric of history, until at some stage the rupture would interfere with the creative processes of Earth themselves. Whatever had happened in space, I had reason to believe that the displacement in time must have been relatively slight. For what had visited me in my weakest hour, and provided me with food, if not that damned creation of Frankenstein's? And if it were so, then the drama of retribution was evidently not yet played out. Surely it was no later than the winter of 1817. If I had encountered Frankenstein's creation, then the creator himself would not be far away. He would be obliged to offer me some aid, knowing I had information to help him in the pursuit of the monster. So the rational mind lays its rational plans. And then I came to a promontory of rock from which I had a view of Geneva, and was shaken. The city was there, surely enough, but the lake had gone, and so had the entire Jura beyond it. Instead of the lake, my gaze rested on a broken expanse of scrubland. Here and there were dotted beggarly trees or thorns. In the far distance something white gleamed, sand or ice, but for the rest there was no predominating feature on which an eye could fix. No roads, no villages, not so much as a solitary building, not even an animal. I saw a riverbed bitten deep into the land, but nothing to suggest that a lake had ever been, or that man had ever trod there. I stood staring for a long while. There must have been another time-slip, but where and when had this unattractive slab of terrain arrived from? There was no limit to the desolation. Almost everyone in what I had once regarded as my own day was probably in a similar predicament. The shattering effects of the war had probably distributed most of the year 2020 backwards and forwards throughout history. I resumed my descent towards a much-changed Geneva. The flood had caused tremendous havoc, breaking down many buildings. Its mark was everywhere, not least in a great universal tide line it had painted, 2 meters above ground level. That mark decorated humble dwellings and proud buildings, churches and statues. The streets were dry again. The level of the new arid ground was several meters above that of the land on which Geneva stood. I saw no bodies, although no doubt many people had drowned, but the damaged houses were pathetic, and wreckage was still being pulled from alleyways and lanes. A few coins remained in my pocket. I spent almost all of them on a visit to a barber and on a meal. About my ruined clothes I felt less concern. The flood had made many people shabby. There was the Frankenstein house. It was too solidly built to have suffered serious damage. All the same, it bore the dirty tide mark along its facade, and the garden had been beaten down. All vegetation was dying after July had felt the breath of January. Remembering that I was an escaped jailbird, whom the Frankenstein menage would not hesitate to give back into custody, I decided that the wisest course was to wait until I could be sure to speak to Victor. So I settled myself in a small tavern just down the street, from one of the windows of which I could see the Frankenstein gate. The hours passed, and there was no sign of my quarry. Perhaps I should have formed a better plan. Perhaps I should have made for the Villa Diodati to see if I could secure friends and allies there. At least it would have given me the prospect of seeing Mary Shelley again. Her presence had never left me. Throughout my worst hours, her pleasant entrances solaced my misery. With dusk, I was forced to leave the tavern. With darkness, I hid in the garden of a villa opposite the Frankenstein mansion. Propped against a gate-post, I fell into a light sleep. I awoke to the sound of a horse in harness, of its hoof idly striking a stone. Peering between the uprights of the gate, I saw that the horse stood before Frankenstein's gate, harnessed to a phaeton. 2 figures appeared dimly by the side of the house. A muttered word. One vanished back into the night. The other climbed into the phaeton. Dark though it was, I had no doubt this was Victor Frankenstein. The darkness surrounding his movements was characteristic of him. He jerked impatiently at the reins, and they were off. I ran across the road and jumped up, clinging to the side of the vehicle. "Frankenstein, it's I, Bodenland. You remember me? I must speak to you." "You, damn you. I thought it was... Well, no matter. What the devil do you want at this hour of night?" "I mean you no harm. I have to speak." I climbed in beside him. In a fury, he lashed his horse on. "This is no hour for conversation. I don't wish to be seen, do you understand me? I'll sit you down at the west gate." "You never wish to be seen. That's part of your guilt. They shut me in your filthy prison. Did you know that?" I had intended to adopt a more conciliatory approach, but his whole manner made me angry. "I have my own affairs, Bodenland. Yours mean nothing to me. People murder and get murdered. So they have done since the world began. It's one of the things that must be altered." "My affairs are yours, Victor. You will have to accept me. I know about the monster that haunts your life." He'd been driving tremendously. Now he slackened pace and turned the pallid oval of his face towards me. "Don't think I didn't hope that you might be buried in prison forever. I have miseries enough. My life is doomed. I've worked only for the common good, humbly trying to advance knowledge." He switched rapidly from defiance to a defensive self-pity. We reached the city gates, bowled through them and out into open country. Frankenstein had made no effort to set me down. There were crates with us in the carriage. He was escaping from home again. "I'm in flight against the evil of the world," he cried at one point. It began to snow lightly again, and we had no protection from it. The horse took a track which led uphill. It began to labour. Victor spoke encouragingly. As we moved through a grove of bedraggled trees, the horse shied violently between the shafts. We were tipped backwards. "Curse you!" cried Frankenstein, striking out with a whip to one side. Then he applied the lash to the horse's flank, and we were off at speed. "Did you see it? Where I am, it is! It haunts me!" I saw nothing. "Inhuman and abhorrent thing! It was steaming. Even this cold weather cannot quell it. It thrives on anything that man detests." Our track led us to a tower. It loomed dimly in the night and snow. Frankenstein jumped down and led the horse through the ruins of outer walls until the tower stood above us. Behind it, a square building had been added, an ugly piece of architecture with only one window, slitted and barred, set close by enormous double doors. On these doors Frankenstein hammered impatiently, and the echo went rolling away through the night. A man appeared with a bull's-eye lantern. We made haste inside, horse, carriage, and all. The man barred the doors behind us. "Give me a hand with these crates, Yet," Frankenstein ordered. The man called Yet was large and solid, built with an ugly muscular body. He said nothing, simply rolling his eyes and dragging Frankenstein's crates from the phaeton. Then he went to unharness the horse. "Do that later. Bring the crates up at once." Without needing to be told, I knew I had reached Frankenstein's secret laboratory. We climbed the tower stairs. The first floor was full of machines, most noticeably a steam engine with rocking beam. This powered a number of small engines with gleaming copper coils, generating electricity for the tower. I believed that Victor was, in this development as in others, some decades ahead of his time. The floor above contained Victor's living quarters. Here he bid me stay, saying that there was only the laboratory overhead, where he did not wish me to enter. Victor's books attracted my attention. There were old vellum-bound folios of alchemical works, far outnumbered by recent volumes on chemistry, electricity, galvanism, and natural philosophy. Many lay open, carelessly scattered about. I'd picked up a box of letters and was glancing at them when Frankenstein returned from above. "Mr. Bodenland, what are we to do with you? If you have information to sell, be so good as to state your price that I may be left in privacy. My work must go ahead." "No, that is what must not happen. I'm here to warn you that your work must stop. I have certain knowledge that it will lead only to further grief." His face was pale in the bitter light from the arcs. "Who are you to act as my conscience? What is this knowledge of the future you bear?" "You know of Lord Byron, of course. Do you know of another poet called Percy Shelley?" "But naturally. A poet of science like Marcus Aurelius, and a better writer than that verse adventurer Byron." "Shelley's future wife, Mary Godwin, will publish a novel about you, using you as a dire example of the way man becomes isolated from nature when he seeks to control nature. Be warned. Desist from your experiments. He took my arm, yet was just climbing through the room on the spiral stair, bearing the last of the packing cases up to the laboratory. "Take care what you say, sir. There's no need to enlighten my servant as well as me." "I presume he knows of that doppelganger of yours outside? Isn't that terrible shadow over your life enough to make you understand that you should desist from further experiment?" "Shelley understood better than you, Bodenland, the passionate quest for truth which overrides any other considerations in the hearts of those who would open the secrets of nature, whether scientists or poets. My responsibility must be to that truth, not to society, which is corrupt. I bestow my gift of the secret of life upon mankind. They must make of it what they will." "How have you bestowed this gift?" "In the most beggarly way possible, by keeping the pride of achievement entirely to yourself, and letting only the foul consequences of your activities out on the community. If mankind knew to whom it should be grateful, don't you think they'd come storming up the hill and burn down your tower?" I saw in him again that curious crumbling, a moral crumbling that was evident when he spoke again, almost in a whining tone. "Who are you to preach at me? Why do you add to my miseries by confronting me with my sins?" At this juncture he yet appeared and stood stolidly at Frankenstein's elbow, bearing a tray. Frankenstein took it automatically and dismissed the man with a curt gesture. As he set plates of cold meat, potato, and onion before us, he said, "You don't know how I'm threatened, Bodenland. My creature, my invention, in whom I instilled the gift of life, escaped from my care. He managed to hide away in the wilds and educate himself. Most unfortunately, he read Milton's great poem, Paradise Lost, from which he discovered religion. You can imagine how damaging such great books are, casting their spells on a completely untutored mind." "Untutored? How can you claim that? Isn't your creature's brain stolen from a corpse that once had life and thought?" "Pah! Nothing's left from the previous existence, only the mere lees and dregs of thought. He now has cast himself in the role of Satan, and I in the role of God Almighty, and he demands that I create for him a mate, a gigantic Eve to give him solace." He glanced involuntarily upwards as he spoke, as if in the direction of heaven, or more likely, the floor above. "But what a project," he said, "to improve on one's first blundering attempts. Do you want 2 fiends after you instead of 1? At present your monster has reason to spare your life. When you have equipped him with a wife, why, it'll be in his interest to kill you." He rested his head on his hand with a weary gesture. "How can you comprehend the difficulties of my situation? The creature has uttered the direst of threats, not against my life, which is of little account, but against Elizabeth's. If I will not bring his bride to life, then he will rob my bride of her life." I stood up. "You already have one implacable enemy. In me you will have a second unless you agree that we go tomorrow into the city and lay the entire matter before the syndics." "Let's eat without quarrelling," he said. "I'll decide after the meal. Look, I'll open some wine. You'd like to drink some wine?" Victor's face was shining, possibly from the heat of the lights. He looked more than ever as if stamped from metal. He snatched up a bottle and 2 glasses, and took them behind his curtain into the kitchen. "I'll open this bottle," he called. When he returned, he carried 2 brimming glasses. "Drink, eat, though civilization crumbles. Let those who are civilized remain so to the end. A toast to you, Bodenland." He raised his glass. I was overcome by a fit of coughing. Could it be? Could it possibly be that he'd poisoned or drugged my wine? The idea seemed melodramatically absurd, until I recalled that all melodrama has its basis in the lurid facts of earlier generations. "Oh, it's so hot under your lights," I said. "Couldn't we open a window?" "Nonsense, it's snowing outside. Drink up." "But that window over there. I thought I heard a noise at it a moment ago." That ruse was more effective. He was up and over to it, peering behind the wooden panel that blocked its panes. "Nothing there. We're far enough above the ground. But that fiend is capable of building a ladder." This was muttered apprehensively to himself. He came back and sat down at the table, raising his glass again and staring at me intently. Now I raised my glass with more confidence, for I had switched it for his. We both drank, staring at each other. So compulsively did he watch me empty my glass that he drained his own in sympathy. I let my mouth fall open and set my glass down heavily on the table, allowing my head to fall back against the chair and my eyes to close, in imitation of unconsciousness. He struggled to get up from his chair. His glass fell to the floor and landed on a rug without breaking. Victor would have fallen too, had I not run round the table and caught him as he staggered. When I had stretched him out on the floor, I stood over him. Now, if ever, was my chance to ruin Victor's plans. Above us lay the laboratory, with all its gruesome secrets. The spiral stair wound upwards, clinging to the rough stone wall of the tower. The door at the top was fortified with extra timbers, and there were many newly installed bolts on the door. I slid back the bolts and pushed open the door. Beyond was a completely cylindrical room, its beamed ceiling some 9 feet high. An arc lamp burned, sending a gleam over the accumulated apparatus. To keep the temperature low, a skylight in the ceiling had been opened a crack. A few flakes of snow drifted about the room. On a great bench to one side of the room lay a monstrous form covered by sheeting. I could see by its outline that it was at least dimly human. Of the machines clustering about the bench I gained no clear idea, except that by the head a tank of a red liquid stood above it, dripping its contents down a tube which led under the sheet. And there were other tubes and other wires which crept under there, coupled to machines which quivered as if they also had some dim expectation of life. On the wall hung beautiful diagrams in the manner of Leonardo da Vinci, of the musculature of limbs and the action of levers. On shelves to one side stood retorts containing limbs floating in preserving fluid, human limbs. One whole shelf was devoted to the human skull. Some skulls had been sawn laterally, some vertically, to reveal the complex chambers inside. Some had been part filled with coloured wax. Others were cosmeticized in a strange way, with banked eye sockets, raised cheekbones, altered brows, modified noses. The effect was of a row of fantastic helmets. I studied a figure chalked on a great blackboard, which stood close to the bench bearing the body. There were perfunctory indications of a face, flowing hair, and the more carefully sketched genitals, showing that a female was depicted. Departures from normal human anatomy were marked in red. The diagram represented 6 extra ribs, thus greatly increasing the lung cage. The respiratory system had been modified. A magnified detail drew attention to the skin. Although I couldn't understand the symbols appended, it looked as if a sort of hide should develop over the flesh, which would render its owner immune to extremes of temperature. I began to understand the magnitude of Frankenstein's accomplishments and ambitions. I turned to the principal occupant of Frankenstein's laboratory, to that sheeted figure lying on its bench surrounded by machines. I had looked on the legendary Frankenstein as a sort of piecemeal dabbler in cadavers, a crank who haunted crypts for mismatched eyes and hands. My error was the fault of horror movie makers. My dear Mary had had a truer idea when she called Victor the modern Prometheus. I stepped forward boldly and pulled the sheets away. There lay a great female figure, naked except for the pipes that fed or drained her. That face. That face, though the hair had been shaven from its head, leaving the skull bald and patterned with livid scars. That face was the face of Justine Moritz. Her eyes, muzzy with death, seemed to be regarding mine. Now I saw starkly the villainy of Frankenstein's researches, and the determination came on me to kill Victor Frankenstein, as well as his creature. The body had been formed from more than one carcass. Skin tones varied, and scars like scarlet ropes ran about the anatomy, so that one was reminded of a butcher's diagram. The amendments sketched on the blackboard had been executed. The modified organs were in place. What had been done in this inspired cobbling together of corpses was a blasphemy. Flesh without spirit was obscene. Why else should the notion of Frankenstein's monster have affronted the imagination of generations? If it was not their intuition of God that was affronted, I fell on my knees and wept, and called aloud to God. I buried my face in my hands and cried with helplessness. There came a sound above me, and I looked upwards. A great beautiful face stared down. The skylight in the beamed roof was flung up, and Frankenstein's Adam came leaping forth to stand before me in his wrath. All I could do at this terrible invasion was to rise and stand with my hands by my sides, staring up at this tremendous being. It was far from being a human face. It resembled much more one of the helmet faces painted on the skulls in the rack behind me. Evidently Frankenstein had been unable to create a face that pleased him, and he had ventured on what I can only call an abstraction of the human face. The eyes were there, glaring down at me from behind high defensive cheekbones, as if through the slits of a visor. The other features, the mouth, the ears, and especially the nose, had been blurred in some fashion by the surgeon's knife. The creature that now stared down at me looked like a machine, lathe-turned. He bent, seized my wrist, and dragged me towards him as if I were no more than a doll. The great hand that held me was a mottled blue, crusted and filthy. From its throat to its feet, the monster was a monument to grime. It was encrusted in mud and blood and excrement. Its great coat was plastered against its trousers. Snow fell from it to the floor. It steamed slightly, so damp was it. This indifference to its wretched state was a further cause for alarm.
"This is no place for you, whoever you may be."
"You saved my life when I was dying on the hillside."
"My role is not to spare life, but to protect my own. Who am I to be merciful?"
"But you did spare my life. I'm grateful for that gift, as perhaps you may be."
"I have no life while everyone's hand is turned against me. But under threat, my Creator has agreed to make me this Eve whose nakedness you uncover. She will make my misery more tolerable, my slavery only half slavery, my exile less a banishment. What are you doing in such a place? Why has he allowed you here? Oh, what mischief have you done him?"
"None! None!" He seized my arm again.
"Nobody is allowed to do him mischief but I. I am his protector as long as he works on this project. Are you the serpent to come here like this, filthy and venomous? We'll see what you have done. Nothing can be hidden from me."
For a moment he turned towards the creature that wore the face of Justine. He placed a gnarled hand tenderly on her brow. Then, dragging me, he strode to the door in 2 strides and flung it open. Without a pause, he moved down the stairs. His movements were rapid and inhuman. I had to run with him, dreading what would come next. Victor Frankenstein still lay senseless on the carpet. His servant yet was bending over him. The monster, coming forward, knocked him out of the way with one sweep of an arm. The force of the blow was such that Yet was flung back against the bookcase. I was dragged forward at that awful pace, like a toy dog on a lead. The monster bent clumsily over his master. I saw Yet pull himself up, eyes charged with fear, and make for the door to the lower regions. When he got there, he pulled an enormous bell-mouthed gun, I imagine it was a blunderbuss, from his belt, and levelled it at the monster. Instinctively I threw myself down. The monster turned. He flung up one arm and gave a great cry as the gun went off.
"You killed my master. Now you have wounded me."
Noise and smoke filled the room. Yet went blundering down the stairs, and the monster gave chase. The noise had its effect on Frankenstein. He would be coming to in a minute. I dashed the remainder of the wine in his face to revive him, and ran back up to the laboratory. I slammed the door shut behind me, but there was no bolt on the inner side. Not that I imagined that any bolt could keep out that terrible avenging creature. The female still lay there, watery eyes staring at some remote distance from which she waited to be recalled. I crossed behind her and seized a pair of steps. I dragged them to the middle of the room, climbed up, swung myself through the skylight by which the monster had entered. Supernaturally strong though the monster was, I could not visualize its being able to scale the sheer outside wall of the tower. Therefore it must have made itself a ladder. It was cold and dark on the roof, despite the snow. I fumbled my way round the battlements until I came to a protruding wooden pole. The ladder! Only the terror of being caught by the creature, I could all too clearly imagine myself being hurled from the roof, drove me to climb over into space and feel for the first rung. I climbed down with difficulty, for there was almost a metre between rungs. At length I stood on the ground, up to my ankles in fresh-fallen snow. First I pulled the great ladder away from the tower, sending it crashing back into the trees. Then I went round to the gate to listen. There was the clang of metal as a bar was withdrawn. A door in the big gates was flung open. Yet emerged, staggering drunkenly and clutching his shoulder. Behind him, something was fighting to get out of the door. It was the monster. Yet stood in the clearing as if undecided. He ambled over to the nearest tree some metres from where I stood hidden, and turned towards the tower. He was wounded and couldn't run. He carried a sword in his hand. The monster still struggled to climb through a door too small for his immense frame. He wrenched at the stout panelling, roaring with fury. With a splintering noise it fell beneath his pressure. He broke through and crossed the clearing in a twinkling. Yet had time for one blow. Maybe it was a sabre he held. I saw a broad blade flash, striking the sleeve of the monster's greatcoat. He gave Yet no time to strike again. He flung the man headfirst into the snow, then sprang savagely on top of him and grappled him by the throat. As once he must have grappled little William, Yet could put up no more resistance than William. In a moment the monster rose, lurching slightly, and started to head back for the dark tower.
"You have killed again!" cried Victor Frankenstein.
He stood in the shattered doorway, confronting his creation. I could see only that sharp-cut face of his, blurred by dark and passion. The monster stopped before him.
"Master, why do you misrepresent my every action? I attacked your servant only because I believed he had killed you. Your possessions and your servants are sacred unto me, as well you know."
You remonstrate with me, you thing of evil, when your hands are still wet with the blood of my little brother. I know you brought about his death, whatever the court said on that score. Then the monster spoke in his desolate voice.
"You must abide by the verdict of the court, for you perforce come within human jurisdiction. It has no such claim on me, being without humanity. I say only this: I struck at you through William. He to me was a limb of you, even as I am. and that filthy deed you've put on to another. Let me enter into the tower, my creator. Bring life to the lovely mate you have prepared. Since you cannot find it in your heart to love me, we will then go our separate ways, forever and ever, never to meet more. I will dwell in the frigid lands with my bride, and no man shall set eyes on us again. Very well, so shall it be, since it cannot be otherwise. Then you must go, and never more afflict my sight. Master, I will feel only gratitude, that I swear. The thoughts that torment me I will forget. How I wish that but once before you banish me we might converse together on fragrant subjects. The grave is never far from my meditations. Master, speak to me once in loving tone of better things. Do not fawn. Stand away. You must come with me into the tower to accomplish this foul work. Since yet is slain, I need your aid. Enter and be silent. When I found you just now, I feared you were killed, master. Confound you, I was not killed, but drugged. Maybe it would have been better for me otherwise. Bodenland was to blame. If you encounter him, fiend, you may exercise your fiendishness on him without restraint. They were now moving inside. I followed to the door and heard the creature's reply. The breaking of necks is no pleasure for me. For a while I stood by the shattered doorway, wondering what to do. Plenty of timber lay about the building. Perhaps I could set fire to the place if I was quick enough. Then they would perish in the flames. The steam engine worked faster overhead as I began searching the building. To one side stood the phaeton. Beyond that was a stable, with a horse standing there indifferently munching. And a more welcome sight met my eyes. There was my automobile, the Felder, unharmed. One of its doors hung open. I climbed in, switching on the overhead lights. Everything was in disorder, but I could see that nothing had been taken. I found a certificate which formally handed the vehicle over to the Frankenstein family. It was signed by the Geneva chief of police, so Elizabeth had been careful to acquire the car as some compensation for her fiancé's supposed murder. But what had Victor made of it? Checking the firearms, I found the swivel gun intact, and a Browning .380 automatic was also present with its box of shells. Then I attempted to push my vehicle into the open. It wouldn't budge. Since I'd have to start the engine sometime in any case, it might be best to do so now, cloaked by the noise of the steam engine thudding overhead. Praise be for the 21st century. The Felder started immediately, and I watched the revs climbing on the rev counter before I began to roll forward into the open. I positioned it some way from the gates of the tower, yet keeping them in view even in the present dismal light. Then I raised the blister and focused the swivel gun. All I had to do was squeeze the button when someone emerged from the tower. That was the best solution. The conversation between Victor and his monster had convinced me of the latter's supreme dangerousness. Given its malevolence, its lying and eloquent tongue was probably as big a threat as its turn of speed. Time passed, and the hours slid slowly down the great entropy slope of the universe. The snow ceased, and a slender moon appeared. The ruined door of the tower was flung open, and the monster emerged. Flat-topped sheets of cloud were moving out of the frigid lands, intermittently obscuring the moon, and the scene was rendered in untrustworthy washes of light. Frankenstein's monster stood outside the shattered door, staring back into the dark from which it had emerged. One of its hands was extended. It took a pace back to the door. There was a hesitancy in his manner which was new. Someone took his hand. A figure emerged from the doorway, a figure almost as gigantic as he. It staggered, and he caught its elbow. They stood together, heads nearly touching. It was the female. He made her walk to and fro. I saw their breath on the frosty air. He was supporting her, an arm about her enormous waist. Her lumbering footsteps kicked up flurries of snow.
Moonlight washed over her features, making of her eyes a perfect blank. It no longer looked like Justine. Another life occupied it. The monster returned, bearing a goblet. He forced her to drink despite her protests. She drank, and he flung the glass down, standing back from her to see what she did. She came to him hesitantly, and he took both her hands in his. Hesitantly they began to trip from side to side, facing each other, he always encouraging her, like two lunatic children in a dance. After a rest, the pair began to prance again. He released her and ran about as slowly as he could. She followed ponderously. Once she fell over, sprawling in the snow. He was upon her instantly, lifting her up with tender, clumsy care, holding her scarred head against his cheek. He urged her to run. He cantered behind the tower. She followed. She was cautious at first, but her movements were coordinating rapidly. She found she could wave her arms as she ran. He stood back to watch in admiration, hands on tattered knees. A strange mooing noise broke from them, which roused the dogs again. She was laughing. Now she gestured to him to follow. She set off round the tower with him in playful pursuit. They were as sportive as a pair of shire horses. When she reappeared, her bald head gleaming dully, her arms were extended, and she was making the mooing noise again. To keep her going, he pretended to be unable to catch her. As he ran, his hair streamed behind that helmet skull like a plume. Her actions were less clumsy now, her movements faster. She stopped suddenly. He clasped her about the waist. She pushed him away with a gesture that would have felled an ordinary man. There she stood, moving her arms, her wrists, her hands, like a Balinese dancer at practice. She was grotesquely dressed in what I took to be nothing more than the two sheets that had covered her on the bench, clumsily knotted about her vast frame. Perhaps because of that, there was something poignant in those androgynous movements parodying grace. My plan to use the swivel gun was gone from my head. When she came very near, I had a clear view of her face, turned brightly to the moonlight. It was the intent face of a female in rut, yet it was also the face of Justine, impersonal with death. If anything, his face was even more horrific, lacking as it did all but a travesty of humanity. Despite his animation, it still most resembled a helmet, a metal helmet with visor down, roughly shaped to conform to the outlines of a human face. The helmet had a tight slit across it, representing a smile. They joined hands. They twirled round and round and round. She broke away, uttering that mooing noise. She began to circle the tower again. Again he followed. The wolves were howling closer at hand. Their discord provided accompaniment for the chase that now developed between the two beings. She darted round and round the tower, running fast, but waving her hands. He kept close behind, not exerting himself. As the pace hotted up, panic entered her movements. She began to run in earnest, he to follow in earnest. I cannot say at what speed they moved, or how many times she circled the base of the tower, running as if her life depended on it. He was calling, making inarticulate noises, grunting and angry. Finally, when his hand was on her shoulder, she half-turned, slapped his arm away, and made as if to burst inside the tower for sanctuary. He seized her in the doorway. With one great heave of his hand, he ripped her flimsy garments from her. Then he sprang, bearing her down into the trampled snow only a few paces from Yet's body. That narrow smile was pressed to the scars on Justine's throat. She half rose at one point, but he bore her down again. She gave a tenor scream, and the wolves answered. A light, uneasy wind licked through the bushes. It was a brief and brutal mating. Then they lay on the ground like two dead trees. She rose first, searching out her sheets and knotting them indifferently about her torso. He got up. Gesturing that she was to follow him, he began to march along the path that led down the hill. Soon I was alone, dry of mouth, sick at heart. For a while I paced up and down in the clearing, consumed by a mixture of emotions. A natural if unfortunate association of ideas made me think of Mary, and wonder where she was in this increasingly confused universe. Sanctity and obscenity lie close in the mind. I had meant to slay the monster. There would have been no glory in it It would just have been a brutal ambush. Had compunction stayed my hand, or mere curiosity? I felt little pride in myself, and knew I would feel still less when I had finished with Victor Frankenstein. Or could it be that his monsters had killed him after he'd brought life to the female? No doubt that might have been their intention. Certainly Victor had suspected as much. By remaining on his guard, though, he could have eluded them. My argument with myself had brought me to a standstill in the snow. Wolves lurked in the forest. I saw their green eyes among the trees, but I had the automatic in my pocket, and was not afraid of them in the midst of so much that was more alarming. Cupping my hand, I shouted at the tower, "Frankenstein!" I was about to call again when there was a movement in the dark beyond the shattered door, and Victor emerged. "So you're still about, eh, Boneland? Why don't you fall silent on your knees before me? I gather you witnessed what I have achieved. I've done something that no other man has done. Power over life and death now belongs to mankind. At last the wearying cycle of the generations has been broken. Oh, come to your senses, man. You know you've merely succeeded in creating a pair of fiends that will multiply and add to man's already great miseries. What makes you think they've not left here in all haste for Geneva and your house where Elizabeth lives? My creature swore to me, swore by the names of God and Milton, that as soon as his mate was created, he would flee with her to the frigid lands, never to return more to the haunts of man. He swore that. What's his oath worth? Haven't you created a patched thing without an immortal soul? How can it have a conscience? I drew my automatic, wondering if I could work myself up to kill him. He seized my other arm pleadingly. "No, don't shoot. Don't be foolish. How can you slay me, who alone understands these fiends, when you spared the fiends themselves? Listen, I had no alternative but to galvanize the tissues of that female into life. You saw how he threatened me. But there is a sure way how we can rid the world of them both. Let me create a third creature." "You're crazy." Dawn was filtering in now. I could see the frenzy of enthusiasm in his face. "Yes, a third, another male. Already I have many of the parts. Jealousy would do the rest. They would fight over the female and kill each other. Put away your pistol, Boneland, I beg. Come inside. Come upstairs. Let me explain. Let me show you my future plans. You're civilized." He moved into the tower. I went after, still holding the automatic. I was following him up the stairs, listening to his voice waver between sense and nonsense, as he too was seized by fear. Please, we have to be above the old considerations, be ruthless as the natural processes governing us. It stands to reason. Look." We had mounted somehow to his living room, transfigured by crisis, like creatures in a Fuseli canvas. I was still pointing the automatic at him. He stumbled towards a desk as he was talking, opened a drawer, bent, began to pull something from it. I fired from close range. He looked up at me. His face was transformed in some terrible way I couldn't explain. It no longer looked like his. He brought a child's skull out into the light, placed it shakingly on the desk top. In a sepulchral and choked voice he said, "Henry will make a suitable husband for—" A ragged cough broke through his chest. Blood spurted from his mouth. He put a hand up, and I made a move forward. "A husband for—" "Victor," I said. Outside, the wolves were howling still. When I let the horse go free and set fire to the Tower of Frankenstein, it was as much to burn out my crime as to have an end to Frankenstein's notes and researches. Leaving a great column of smoke behind me, I climbed into my automobile and drove to see if the Villa Diodati and the Champagne Chapuis were still in existence on this plain. They were not. They'd gone. The frigid lands began no more than a stone's throw from where Mary's door had stood. It will seem odd to say I was relieved, but there was relief in the discovery, for I felt myself too soiled to approach her again. I could not rid my thoughts of Victor's death or of the mating dance. The two happened simultaneously, the one linked event, one in violence and in the annihilation of personality. At least the graven image of reality had been destroyed for me, so that I no longer had difficulty in apprehending Frankenstein and his monsters, Byron, Mary Shelley, and the world of the year 2020 as coexistent. What I had done, so it seemed, was to wreck the fatalism of coming events. If Mary Shelley's novel could be regarded as a possible future, then I had now rendered it impossible by killing Victor. Such thoughts opened vistas of complexity. Possibility and time levels seemed as fluid as clouds which meet and merge eternally, forever changing shape and altitude. Yet even the clouds are subject to immutable laws. In the flux of time there would always be immutable laws. But somewhere there might be a year 2020 in which I existed merely as a character in a novel about Frankenstein and Mary. I had altered no future, no past. I had merely diffused myself over a number of cloud-patched times. There was no future, no past, only the cloud sky of infinite present states. Man was prevented from realizing this truth by limitations of consciousness. Consciousness had never evolved as an instrument designed to discover truth. It was a tool to hunt down a mate or the next meal. Drooped over the steering column, I fell into a swooning sleep. When I woke, Victor was still with me, dying all over again, my hand reaching out as if to save him, as if in ridiculous apology. Murder! I dared not think of God. Well, I'll try to say no more of this. Frankenstein had gone. One thing remained. I had now to take on his role of monster killer. Imperfectly though I recalled Mary's novel, I knew that her Frankenstein had embarked on a pursuit of his creature, which had taken them both into those gloomy and ice-bound regions that held so strong a lure for the romantic imagination. For 2 days I drove along the fringes of the frigid lands, following roughly the shores of the old lake, trying to pick up a trace of the monsters. No human being questioned my appearance now. Their lives had been utterly disrupted, their crops were ruined, and the winter promised starvation for all. Extreme though the times were, the two monsters would have remained sufficiently remarkable, prodigies in a time of prodigies. Towards sunset on the second day, I happened on a hamlet where there was a hostelry called the Silver Stag, at which I made my inquiries. The owner said his stable had been broken into the previous night. He'd lit a lantern and gone down to see what was happening, and an enormous man, a foreigner he suspected, had come rushing from the stable, dragging the best horses with him. After him came another great foreigner, pulling the donkey. He'd been swept out of the way. He called on his neighbours for help. By the time they arrived, the two enormous thieves had gone, riding down the road with the innkeeper's dog, a German shepherd, still snapping at their heels. He took me and showed me how brutally the lock on the stable had been broken and adjacent timber shattered. I'd seen such damage before. I paid for some dried wurst and drove away in the direction the innkeeper indicated. Once into the frigid lands, I paused to sleep and bring this account up to date. On the morrow, I would begin the pursuit. Even before the time-broken landscape met my gaze next morning, Victor Frankenstein was there before my eyes as usual, falling as usual behind the old desk, unable as usual to speak Elizabeth's name for blood. I climbed out of the car, performed my natural functions, rinsed my face in an icy stream. Nothing could refresh my soul. I'd lied, cheated, committed adultery, looted, thieved, and ultimately murdered. Henceforth my only fit company was the two brutes who journeyed some way ahead of me. My only fit surroundings, the frigid hinterlands of hell, which I now entered. I had taken over Victor's role. Henceforth there was only the hunt to the death. Of the first part of that journey I shall tell briefly. Came the day when the nature of the land altered. As I moved forward, I saw the change ahead. The land became rougher, the clumps of grass coarser and more upstanding, the dull, dark pools of water more frequent. It was not impossible that another time-slip had been at work here, amalgamating two similar territories which had formerly lain many thousands of miles and maybe many thousands of centuries apart. A slight incline marked the division between territories. Here I found a distinct trail branching two ways. I drove to the top of the incline, stopped, and climbed out to look about me, uncertain whether to take the left track or the right. Something had not been content to leave matters to chance. On the left-hand track lay the body of an animal. I found it was the carcass of a fine German sheepdog, its skull shattered by a blow. Its muzzle pointed along the trail. Day followed day as I continued the journey, days without distinction or differentiation. Not only was the weather icily still, the days themselves were without sunset, for the sun no longer sank below the land. A mournful beauty infiltrated this period, in which the only persistent qualities were the most amorphous ones. Banks of mist, towers of cloud, layers of silvery fog, pools which reflected the curtained sky. These were the durable features of the place. Amid such a phantasmal landscape, small wonder if I saw phantoms, Victor forever clutching at his coat and falling behind the desk, the monster steaming as it leapt forward. But of living things there was none. I reached the snow line. Nothing grew here, nothing lived. Still I drove, thinking my quarry must be near. Surely they couldn't have rivaled my swiftness over the plain. I climbed towards a great pass. Beyond it were glaciers, snow, huge boulders, a broken line of further peaks. Despite the heating in the felder, my bones were aware of an intense cold outside. High eroded cliffs formed the walls of the pass. The road ran under one cliff. To the other side was the fan-shaped outcrop of a glacier. The glacier became larger as I drove along by its side. The road narrowed, trapped between cliff and glacier. Soon it was squeezed almost to nothing, and I was forced to stop. My path was barred by the debris from the glacier. Although I knew I had to get up the pass, there was nothing for it but to back away. I returned to the point where a moraine of stones marked the forward edge of the glacier. And at one spot a way had been cleared. Something was lying there. Despite the cold, I climbed out to look. The blooded leg of a horse, apparently wrenched from its socket, lay with its hoof pointing into the heart of the glacier. There was nothing for it but to accept this horrid invitation. I drove the vehicle forward onto the ice. The surface proved no bad road. It was almost free of debris. Possibly it would be more correct to speak of my being on an ice stream rather than a glacier proper. All I can say is that it looked increasingly as if I were in some part of Greenland. The surface had a ripple pattern, rather like barred sand on a shore where the tide has gone out, which gave the tires something to grip on. I had increased speed when a crevasse appeared ahead. Braking immediately, I slowed the engine and threw it into reverse, but the automobile went into a skid and its front wheels slipped over into the gulf. I was securely trapped. I could fit an attachment to the vehicle's nuclear plant which would melt the ice, or I could try to jack up the front axle, but neither expedient held any guarantee that the felder would be freed. I looked about helplessly at the wilderness of rock and ice. Far beyond, I could catch a glimpse of the plain between two crags. It was marked by little more than a blue-green line. How greatly I had ventured beyond all human contact. Staring up the ice in the direction I planned to go, I saw a familiar figure. Pallid face, black coat, hand at throat as he moved dying over the ice. Victor, eternally returning. He was calling to me, voice echoing hollowly over the unsympathetic surfaces about us. Two figures were up there, monstrous in outline, partly cancelled by the black-lit clouds that came boiling up from behind them and the peaks in the background. They were waving their clumsy arms about their heads to attract my attention. I could make out that they had with them a string of horses, some with packs. These were presumably some of the wild horses I had observed on the plain. I was glad to see them there. They spoke my language. They were living things, or replicas thereof. Belatedly, it occurred to me that my mission was to kill them. Climbing back into the front seat, I raised the blister in the roof and brought up the muzzle of the swivel gun. If I killed them now, I could take over their horses and make my way back to human society. But with the car so down on the front axle, the firing angle was bad. I squinted at them through the telescopic sights, and already they were half lost among shattered stones. Satisfied that they had attracted my attention, they were moving on. As much for my own satisfaction as their dismay, I sent half a dozen rounds whining over their heads. They disappeared. Only a pair of horses remained to be seen. Laying my cheek against the gun, I stared up there where the world seemed to end. My quarry had left me a means of following them, of continuing the chase. I attempted to hitch the two horses to the front axle and pull the vehicle out of the crevice, but it would not budge, so I had to abandon it. All I took from it were the remains of my food and water, this tape memory, my sleeping bag, a stove, and the swivel gun, which I unbolted from its frame. With the swivel gun went several magazines of ammunition. This equipment I loaded onto the smaller of the two horses. I dressed myself in as many clothes as I could and mounted the other horse. We began to pick our way slowly up the glacier, and the Felder was lost behind us. Night descended. I looked upwards to identify familiar constellations. Never had so many stars blazed forth, never so unrecognizably. The night sky was no stranger to me, yet I was puzzled. There seemed to be a pole star where it should be, and the constellation of Ursa Major, yet with additional stars scattered across it. But wasn't that also Ursa Major and the stars over there, lower down the sky and some degrees away, half concealed by a shoulder of mountain? We picked our way forward. More stars came into view. Yes, I travelled in a dual universe. The rupture of space-time was spreading in a chain reaction. Who knew what galaxies might exist tomorrow night? Rather than rest, I climbed off my horse and led the two beasts forward, determined to stay on my feet for the rest of the night. But the night seemed to go on forever. It was still dark, or at least not light, when finally I reached the end of my climb and the glacier became level. A great plateau stretched before me, its limits hidden. The plateau was formed of ice, a tremendous weight of ice which covered great mountains below. A few peaks broke the surface here and there in the form of nunataks. Over this great ice field, the nunataks formed the only landmarks, with one staggering exception. Far away over the ice field was a mighty building. I halted the animals. From where I stood, it was hard to grasp the size of that distant structure. It appeared to consist of little more than an immense circular wall. It was certainly inhabited. From within the walls came a glow of light, almost an atmosphere of light, reddish in colour, and punctuated by intenser beams of brightness, moving within the central cloud. Elsewhere, dull depression reigned. Yet this was no bastion of light. For all its brightness, it too, I attempt no paradox, it radiated drabness. My speculation was that this was the last refuge of humanity. The place was so remote that I could only believe the time-slips to have delivered me to a point, many centuries, maybe thousands or even millions of centuries into futurity. I might be witnessing the last outpost of mankind after the sun had died, when the universe itself was far gone towards the equipoise of its death. As I moved forward at a better pace, I wondered why the enemy should have led me to a refuge rather than onward to destruction. Could it be that they also were intending to enter this place, or were they waiting somewhere to tear me apart before I reached shelter? Drawing nearer, I could make out gates set in the immense outer walls, and I saw towers within, obscured rather than illuminated by the flickering blaze. They were enormous buildings. I hardly knew whether the sight of them filled me with comfort or foreboding. The horses shook their heads and whinnied. I went cautiously, for we were approaching a nunatak, and I feared ambush. There was no sign of the two monsters. I unloaded the swivel gun on the top of the nunatak, sheltering it from falling snow with my packs. To protect myself from the cold, I climbed into the sleeping bag. Then I peered through the telescopic sights and endeavoured to trace my quarry. There they were. Although their two figures were difficult to discern against the great dark walls ahead, their outlines were fitfully picked out by the red glare. They had reached the city and were about to enter it. A new suspicion came on me. I'd no guarantee that this city was built by human hands. To what human city would these two outcasts go? This was a city that would welcome them, that indeed might be heralding them by this tremendous extravagance of light. This could be a city built and occupied by their own kind. The future must be theirs, and not ours. I jammed a magazine into the breech of the gun. Its code told me that 1 bullet in 5 was a tracer. A gate was opening in the distant walls. Light poured out over the two enormous figures. I began firing as they started to enter. A bright line of fire plunged across the intervening space. I saw the first bullet strike and kept on firing. One of the figures, the woman, seemed to blaze. She spun about. Her arms jerked up in anger. More tracer poured into her. She broke apart as she fell. He was also hit, but he ran away from the light, so that I no longer had a silhouette as target. He was coming. Making full use of that terrible deadly speed, he was racing across the ice towards me, arms and legs plunging in a speed no human could rival. There was a glimpse of that cruel, grinning helmet of a face as I wrenched the barrel round for better aim. It stuck. One side of my sleeping bag had caught in the gun's track. It was a moment's work to tear it loose, but in that moment he was nearly on me. With a strength almost beyond myself, I raised the gun and fired it from the hip. The tracer caught him as he charged up the slope. Fire burned at his chest. A great bellow of fury broke from him. He fell backwards, tearing at his burning clothes. The horses broke their tethers and went galloping away across the plains of ice. Clutching my automatic, I went slowly down to where the great figure lay. It stirred, turned over, drew itself into a sitting position. Its face was black. Smoke obscured it. The monster spoke.
"In trying to destroy what you cannot understand, you destroy yourself. Only that lack of understanding makes you see a great divide between our natures. When you hate and fear me, you believe it is because of our differences. Oh, no, Bodenland, it is because of our similarities that you bring such detestation to bear upon me."
He could not rise. A hollow cough burst from him, and a change took place in that abstract helmet which was his face. The sutures of Frankenstein's surgery parted. Ancient cicatrices opened at every contour. The whole countenance cracked. Slow blood oozed in the apertures. He put a hand up, not to his cheeks, but to his chest, where the greater pain was. "We're of different universes. I'm a natural creature. You're a horror unalive. I was born. You were made."
"Our universe is the same universe, Bodenland, where pain and retribution rule. Our deaths are both a quenching out. As for our births, when I first opened my eyes, I knew I existed, as did you. But who I was, or where, or from what cause, I knew not. No more did you. As for those intervals between birth and destruction, my intentions, however warped, are more lucid to me than yours to you, as I suspect. You know compassion."
A spasm of pain possessed him. Again I nerved myself to fire. A rocket flashed into the sky and burst overhead, deflecting me from my purpose. It opened into 3 great clusters of flame, which hung over us silent before fading. A signal. To whom or to what, I knew not. Before the lurid light went out, the monster at my feet said,
"This I will tell you, and through you all men, if you are deemed fit to rejoin your kind, that my death will weigh more heavily upon you than my life. No fury I might possess could be a match for yours. Moreover, though you seek to bury me, yet will you continuously resurrect me. Once I am unbound, I am unbounded."
The creature heaved himself to his feet and stood confronting me, fire still creeping at his chest and throat. Although he was below me on the slope, he dominated me. "There will be no more of you," I said. I fired into that voluminous greatcoat. He went down on one knee and gave a loud cry, then lost balance and fell forward to lie face down. The monster was finished, and my quest. Trembling, I set the swivel gun to rights. If other attackers came for me, they should meet the same reception as the monster before I met my maker. Or there might be men in the city. I must assume nothing more until more was known. So I would wait here until someone or something came for me, biding my time in darkness and distance.